Richard Vane did not raise his voice when he was angry. That was the part that made it worse. He spoke in the same flat, unhurried tone, whether he was ordering supper or breaking a woman's ribs, and Elena had learned to read the difference not in his words, but in the way his jaw set, the way he folded his hands on the table, the way the air in whatever room he occupied went thin and cold. That morning, she had burned the bread. It was a small thing, a distracted moment, a mind somewhere else, on the frost along the window pane, on the sound of geese moving south overhead, on the fact that her left hand still ached from 3 weeks ago, and she had not told anyone because there was no one to tell. Richard came into the kitchen, looked at the bread, looked at her, and said, "Come here." That was all. What happened next lasted less than 2 minutes. Elena counted in the way that people count who have learned that counting is the only control they have left. Afterward, she was on the floor with her hand pressed to her side, and Richard was washing his hands at the basin, unhurried, his cuffs already rolled back down, and he said, "Fix it before the men come in for breakfast." Then he walked out, and the door didn't even slam, because Richard Vane did not slam doors. She fixed the bread. 3 weeks later, she ran. She didn't plan it well. There wasn't time for a good plan. There was only time for now, for the window of 30 minutes, when she knew where all his men were, and where the horses stood unguarded. She took nothing except a coat that wasn't hers, and a handful of dried jerky from the smokehouse, and she ran north, because north was the only direction that put the river between her and the valley Richard owned. She made it 4 days before they caught her. What happened after that? She never told anyone the whole of it, not even later, not even when there was someone who might have understood. Some things you carry differently when you keep them only to yourself. Some things you pack down into the marrow of you, and you learn to walk normally around the weight. What she could say was this. When they left her, she was lying on her back in the brown autumn grass beside a creek that had gone mostly to ice, and the sky was the color of old pewter, and she was fairly sure she was dying. She thought about her mother. She thought about a blue dress she'd had at 15. She didn't think about much else. Then she heard something. A horse, more than one, the creak of a saddle, the particular sound of a child humming a small, tuneless song. And she thought, that's a strange thing to hear at the end, and she tried to move her fingers just to see if she still could. That is where this story begins. Not with Elena's suffering, though God knows that is part of it. Not with Richard Vane and his flat voice and his clean hands. It begins at a frozen creek on a Tuesday afternoon in October, with a little girl named Lily Holloway, who was 6 years old and who noticed things that grown people missed, because children who have known loss learn early to pay attention to the world. Before we go any further, if a story like this is the kind that finds its way into your chest, if you've ever rooted for someone who had been left for dead, stay with us. Hit that subscribe button so you don't miss what's coming. Drop a comment below and tell us what city or country you're watching from. It means everything to know how far these stories travel. Now, back to that cold October afternoon, and a little girl and a woman in the grass. Caleb Holloway had not intended to ride the north pasture that day. He had a fence line down on the south side that needed mending before the ground froze solid, and he had already told Lily she'd ride with him to the south, and Lily had packed herself a small canteen and a biscuit wrapped in a cloth like she was preparing for an expedition, and the plan was set. But the mare he usually rode had thrown a shoe that morning, which meant he was on the buckskin gelding named Cobb instead, and Cobb had opinions about the south pasture that came out in the form of sidling and ear-pinning whenever you turned him that direction. Caleb had fought the horse twice and lost twice, and then said something under his breath that he hoped Lily hadn't heard, though from the way she looked at the saddle horn he suspected she had. "We'll go north," he said. "Check the creek line." "I thought the fence was south," Lily said. "The fence can wait." "You said it couldn't wait." "Lily." She was quiet for a moment. "Okay," she said, in the tone she used when she was conceding the argument but not agreeing with him, a distinction she had apparently learned from her mother and had not forgotten despite being only 2 when Agnes died. They rode north. Caleb was not by nature a talkative man. He had grown up in a family where conversation was practical. You spoke when you had something to say, and you said it clearly, and you did not embellish. Agnes had found this both endearing and infuriating in equal measure, and had spent 7 years trying to teach him to share what was in his head before it fossilized there. He had gotten better. Not good, but better. Now, riding next to his daughter in the last thin warmth of an October afternoon, he found himself listening to her more than speaking, which was usually how it went. Lily talked about things in the order they occurred to her, without hierarchy. A hawk she had seen on the fence post 3 days ago. A question about whether horses dreamed. A report on the progress of a particular anthill near the barn that she had been monitoring since August. The information that her friend Clara's family had a new dog. And did he think they might ever get a dog? And if so, what would they name it? "We have enough animals," Caleb said. "That's not an answer about the name. A dog would need a dog name." "That's not helpful." He almost smiled. Almost. The creek came into view around a low bend in the land, the water running slow and dark between ice-crusted banks, and Caleb was scanning the tree line for the fence markers when Cobb pulled up short and blew hard through his nose, the particular sound horses made when they smelled something that didn't belong. Caleb brought him around. The grass on the near bank was brown and flat, and it took him a moment to see it. A shape that didn't fit, a form too large to be deadfall, the wrong kind of stillness, the kind that made the back of his neck go tight. "Stay here," he said to Lily. She was already looking. Children had that too, the animal instinct that knew when something was wrong before the brain finished the question. "What is that?" she said. "Stay here," he said again, and swung down from the horse. He crossed the bank slowly because you didn't know what you were walking toward, and you didn't know what had caused it. And a man who moved fast in ignorance sometimes made things worse. The grass crunched under his boots. The wind had stopped, which made the silence feel thick and particular, the kind of silence that pressed. He was close enough to see the coat first. Dark wool, too thin for the weather, meant for town, not for the open country. Then a hand, pale, the fingers curled slightly toward the palm. Then the rest of her, a woman lying on her back in the dead grass, her face turned slightly to the side, her dark hair loose and tangled with burrs and dried creek mud. His first thought was, "She's dead." His second thought, following so closely it nearly overlapped, "No." Because the hand moved. Just the fingers, just barely, a small unconscious flex, the body's last argument against going still. He dropped to one knee beside her and said, "Hey," and then felt the inadequacy of the word and said it again anyway, because there was nothing better. She didn't open her eyes. He put 2 fingers to the side of her neck and found the pulse, faint, irregular, but there, unmistakably there, stuttering along like a candle in a draft. And he felt something in his chest loosen and then immediately tighten again, because alive was not the same as safe, and she was a long way from safe. "Daddy!" Lily's voice came from just behind him, which meant she had dismounted and followed him across the bank despite being told to stay, and on any other occasion he would have said something about that. But not now. "Daddy," she moved. "I know." "Is she dead?" "No." Lily came to stand beside him and looked down at the woman in the grass with an expression Caleb recognized. The serious, careful face his daughter wore when she was working out something that mattered. Not afraid, not horrified. Thinking. "She looks cold," Lily said. "She is cold. We should take her home." It was not a question. It was the kind of statement that 6-year-olds make when something is obviously true and they cannot understand why adults are still standing there thinking about it. Caleb looked at the woman, at the swelling along her jaw, at the way she held her ribs even in unconsciousness, at the bruising that had gone past fresh and was settling into the dark purple-green of days-old damage, and understood immediately that this had not been an accident, had not been a fall, had not been an encounter with weather or wildlife or bad luck alone. Someone had done this to her. Someone had done this and then put her here and ridden away. He felt the particular cold anger that he kept, when he felt it, very quiet and very deep, because it was the kind of anger that could make a man do things he hadn't decided to do yet. He pressed it down. "Go get Cobb," he said to Lily. "Bring him over here." Lily went without arguing, which told him she understood the gravity of the moment in the way that children sometimes do, absorbing it through the air without needing it explained. Caleb slid his arms carefully under the woman, careful because he didn't know what was broken and didn't want to make it worse, and felt her whole body tense at his touch without her waking, the flinch of someone whose body had learned to brace before the mind could process the threat. "Easy," he said, though he knew she couldn't hear him. "Easy. I've got you." He lifted her, and she was light in a way that worried him. Getting her onto the horse was not graceful. Caleb was a large man and she was a grown woman, and Cobb had opinions about unusual arrangements, and the whole operation involved a fair amount of improvisation, and one moment where Caleb nearly lost his grip and had to plant his feet and reassemble his hold, and Lily stood nearby holding Cobb's bridle with both hands and talking to the horse in a low, steady voice, the way she did when she wanted him to behave. "Good boy," Lily kept saying. "Good boy, Cobb. Stand still, you. Good boy." It worked, eventually. Caleb rode with the woman held across the saddle in front of him, one arm around her, trying to keep her steady, trying to keep her from slipping. Lily rode behind on the spare mount, close, watching. They didn't speak much on the way home. The light was going and the wind had picked up, and the woman in Caleb's arms made a sound once, a small sound like a question, and didn't wake. "Almost there," he told her, though he still wasn't sure she could hear him. "Almost there." "What?" He sent Lily for the doctor the moment they reached the ranch, sent her on the fast mare with a note in her coat pocket in case words failed her, which they sometimes did in emergencies, because Lily was brave, but she was also 6, and the world was large. He told her to go straight to Doc Harlan's house and not to stop for anything and to tell him it was urgent. "I know what urgent means," she said. "I know you do. Go." She went. Caleb carried the woman inside and put her on the bed in the spare room and built up the fire and did what he could, which was not much. He'd helped deliver calves and set a broken leg and pulled a man out of a barn fire once, but he was not a doctor, and the list of things that might be wrong with her was long enough that he didn't trust himself to start guessing. He got her out of the wet coat and covered her and put a warm cloth on her forehead and sat in the chair by the fire and waited. In the lamplight she looked worse than she had in the field, which he supposed was because in the field you couldn't see the details. The bruising along her jaw extended down her neck. Her lower lip was split and had been split more than once, the scar tissue already there before the fresh damage. Her hands, he had noticed them when he was settling her in. The knuckles had the look of hands that had been used to try to protect a face, that particular pattern of defensive damage that you recognized when you knew what you were looking at. He had been a rancher his whole life. He had seen violence in the way that all frontiermen saw it, in the abstract and in the particular, in range disputes and drunken nights in town and weather that didn't care if you lived. He had never sat in a chair beside something like this and felt the specific weight of it, the specificity of cruelty, what it meant that someone had methodically dismantled a person. He was still sitting there when Doc Harlan came through the door an hour later, Lily at his heels and his black bag in his hand and his reading glasses already on his face. "Go to the kitchen, Lily," Caleb said. "But, kitchen." She went. Doc Harlan was 63 years old and had been practicing medicine in the territory since before Caleb was born. He had the quality of a man who had seen too much to be surprised by anything, which in Caleb's experience was sometimes a comfort and sometimes not. He put his bag down, looked at the woman in the bed, and was quiet for a moment. "Where'd you find her?" he said. "North Creek, near the Alderman markers." "Alone?" "Alone." Harlan made a sound that was not quite a response and was not quite nothing, and then he went to work. Caleb stood near the door while the doctor did what needed doing, and kept his face still, and asked only when he couldn't help it. "What are we looking at?" "2 broken ribs, at minimum." Harlan's hands moved careful and professional, and he didn't look up. "Bruising across the abdomen. Nothing ruptured, from what I can tell, but she needs to stay still. She's dehydrated, hasn't had a decent meal in a while." He paused. "This isn't a fall, Caleb." "I know." "You know who she is?" "No." Harlan said nothing for a moment. Then, "I've seen this before. Not here. Billings, years ago. A woman who came in after her husband." He set down his instrument and straightened up, finally looking at Caleb. "This was sustained, over time. This isn't one bad night." The room was warm from the fire, and Caleb felt cold anyway. "She gonna be all right?" "If she rests. If she doesn't do something to tear those ribs again. If she gets food and water and doesn't push herself." Harlan pulled the blanket up over her. "If. There's some fever coming, I think. We'll watch it." "All right. You know what you're bringing into your house?" Caleb looked at the woman in the bed, at her face, still and pale and younger than he'd first thought, maybe late 20s, maybe 30, and thought about Lily sending him to the north pasture by insisting on the name of a horse, and the way she'd said we should take her home like it was the simplest thing in the world. She needed help, he said. Harlan looked at him for a moment. Fair enough, he said, and started packing his bag. She woke twice in the night. The first time was brief. She opened her eyes, looked at the ceiling, seemed not to understand what she was seeing, and closed them again before Caleb could say anything. He wasn't even sure she was fully conscious. The second time was near dawn. He had dozed in the chair and woke to the sound of her breathing changing, faster, the small sounds of someone surfacing from a deep place. He sat up. She was looking at him. Not with fear, exactly, though the fear was there, just behind her eyes, the kind that lived there permanently, that didn't switch off even when the immediate danger had passed. But she was looking at him with something more deliberate than panic, something more like assessment, like a person calculating how much trouble she was in and what her options were. You're safe, he said, then felt the inadequacy of that and pushed through it. You're in my house. I found you by the creek. You've been unconscious most of the night. My name is Caleb Holloway. She didn't say anything for a moment, just looked at him, that careful, calculating look. Lily? She said. Her voice was barely there. He blinked. How do you know? Oh, girl, she said. Little girl. I heard her. In the grass. She stopped, swallowed with difficulty. She was talking to the horse. That was my daughter, he said. Lily, she's fine. She's asleep. Something in the woman's face shifted. Not relaxed exactly, but something, like a small piece of a wall that had been holding for a long time, suddenly wasn't required to hold quite so hard. Okay, she breathed. Can you tell me your name? A pause. He understood later what that pause was about. The instinct to give a false name, to give no name, to give a name that couldn't be tracked. The calculation that happened behind her eyes in that moment. Then, Elena, she said. Elena Whitmore. He nodded. All right, Elena. I can't stay. She moved and then made a sound that stopped everything, a sharp involuntary intake that she tried to cut off immediately and almost succeeded. Don't, he said. You've got broken ribs. Don't move fast. I have to go, she said through her teeth, though she had gone still. I can't be here if he... She stopped. If who finds you? She looked at him. The fear in her eyes was old and specific and entirely different from the shock of waking up in an unfamiliar room. This was the fear of someone who had been afraid for a very long time. You don't want to know, she said. I found you half dead in a field, Caleb said, not unkindly, but plainly, because plain was what he had. I think I'm already involved. She was quiet for a long moment. Outside, the first pale light of dawn was beginning to show around the curtain edges. In the kitchen, something settled in the stove. His name is Richard Vane, she said finally. He owns most of the valley south of Billings. He has men. She looked at Caleb steadily, and he understood she was not saying this to frighten him, but to give him accurate information, because she was the kind of person who believed in accurate information, even when the information was bad. He will come looking. For you? He will call it that, she said. He'll say I'm his wife. He'll say I was confused or sick or I ran away in a fit of something. He'll be very calm and very polite, and he'll make it sound reasonable. She paused. He usually does. Caleb sat with that for a moment. Is he your husband? He said. He was, she said, in every legal sense of the word. I had a document. She said it like the document was a joke she'd stopped finding funny. I thought that meant something. When did you leave? 4 days ago. I had horses to the Murdoch River and then I walked. She said it without self-pity, just as a recitation of events. His men caught me on the second day. They brought me back and... She stopped again. This time the stopping was different. This time it was something she was not going to say, a room she was not going to open. And then they left me. Left you at the creek. I suppose they thought I would finish dying on my own and save them the trouble. She said it so flatly it took him a moment to register what she'd said. Then she looked at him, and he thought he saw, just for an instant, something that was almost dark amusement. I'm stubborn. I noticed, he said. She was quiet. Then, I should go. He'll come here. He'll... Lie still, Caleb said. Not harsh, but firm. You've got 2 broken ribs and a fever coming, and you haven't eaten in days. You're not going anywhere. You don't understand what he's capable of. Maybe not, Caleb said, but I understand what happens to people who move on broken ribs in winter. I've seen that too. He stood up from the chair and she tracked the movement, the instinctive attention to where a person was in the room, and he made himself move slowly, the way he moved around a spooked animal. Not because she was an animal, but because she deserved the same basic decency of not being startled further. I'll get you water, then you sleep. We figure the rest out in the morning. She looked at him for a long moment. He could feel her calculating, threat, trustworthiness, what she was risking against what she was risking on the other side. And he stood still and let her look, because she had earned the right to take the measure of everyone who came near her. All right, she said at last. He brought her water. She drank carefully, because even that hurt, and didn't complain. When he looked in an hour later, she was asleep. The fever came that afternoon, as Harlan had predicted, and stayed for 3 days. Caleb was not an expressive man, but he was a capable one, and during those 3 days he discovered that nursing a sick person required a peculiar combination of patience and bluntness that he happened to possess. He kept the fire. He changed the cloth on her forehead. He got water into her in small amounts when she was lucid enough to swallow. He sent Lily to the neighbors twice with messages for Harlan and received instructions back both times, along with a small bottle of something that Harlan said would help with the fever. Lily, during those 3 days, was solemnly helpful. She brought things without being asked, a second blanket, a cup of broth that she had made herself from something she'd watched the housekeeper make before Mrs. Prentice had gone back east to her sister's, a broth that was thin and not particularly flavorful, but was hot and constituted a real effort. She stood in the doorway of the sick room and looked at Elena with that serious face. Is she going to wake up again? Lily asked on the second day. She's woken up a few times, Caleb said. Does she know where she is? Sometimes. Lily considered this. When she wakes up and she's scared, she said carefully, like she was picking her words out of a pile. You could tell her about Mama. Caleb looked at his daughter. Tell her Mama was nice, Lily said. It might help if she knows that a nice person used to live here. She thought about it. Sometimes knowing a place had good things in it makes it feel safer. He didn't say anything for a moment. Lily was looking at him with complete seriousness, entirely unaware of what the suggestion cost him and what it gave him simultaneously. That's a good idea, he said. Lily nodded like she'd expected as much and went back to whatever she'd been doing. On the third night, the fever broke. Caleb was in the chair when it happened, half asleep, and he felt the change before he was fully awake, the quality of her breathing, something releasing. He leaned forward and put his hand to her forehead, and it was cooler, significantly cooler, still warm but wrong in a different way, the productive wrong of a body fighting and winning. She opened her eyes and looked at the ceiling and then looked at him. Still here, she said. Still here, he agreed. She looked at him for a moment, not calculating this time, something different, something that had less defense in it. Maybe the fever had burned some of it off. Maybe 3 days of someone not hurting you while you were at your most helpless had adjusted something in her accounting. The little girl, she said. Does she know? She knows you were hurt and you needed help, he said. She's been making you broth. Something crossed Elena's face that he couldn't name precisely. Not quite a smile. Her lip was still healing and smiling wasn't comfortable, but the approximation of one, the shape that the face made when it was thinking about smiling. Broth, she said. It's better than it sounds. She was quiet. Then, your wife, is she? She died, he said. 4 years ago. Fever, same as what you had. Different kind. He said it in the plain way he said difficult things, not because it didn't matter, but because the plainness was the only way he could get through it without stopping. Her name was Agnes. Elena looked at him. I'm sorry, she said, and he could tell she meant it, not as a formality, but as someone who understood that loss was specific and had weight. Lily left her mother's quilt on the foot of your bed, he said. She decided you needed it more than the cedar chest did. Elena glanced toward the foot of the bed. He watched her look at the quilt, something hand-stitched in a pattern of blue and gold, worn soft from use. She looked at it for a long time. When she looked back at him, her eyes were wet, which she clearly was not pleased about, and she made a small motion like she was going to raise her hand to her face and then stopped because of the ribs, and then just held still with her expression under tight control. "Why?" she said, and stopped. "Why what? Why are you doing this?" It wasn't quite a question, more like something she needed to say out loud to understand. Caleb thought about it. Not the way he would have thought about it if he'd prepared an answer, but really thought, sitting there in the chair by the fire in the middle of the night, which was not a time for prepared answers. "Lily found you," he said finally. "She's 6. If I had ridden away, she would have known, and I couldn't—" He stopped, started again. "I couldn't have her know her father was someone who rode away." Elena looked at him for a long moment. "That's a good reason," she said. "It's the true one," he said. Outside, the wind had picked up again, moving across the plains in the dark, and the fire in the stove ticked and shifted, and somewhere across the house Caleb could hear the small, even sounds of Lily sleeping. The fever was over. The worst of it, anyway. The rest, the ribs healing, the strength coming back, the question of Richard Vane and what came next. That was still out there, still patient in the dark, still moving toward them. But not tonight. Tonight, Elena Whitmore was alive, and she was inside, and she was looking at a quilt that a little girl had taken from a cedar chest, because she had decided that a stranger who had been left to die in the grass deserved to sleep under something warm and well-made. "Thank you," Elena said, very quietly, like the words had cost her something. "Sleep," Caleb said. "We'll deal with the rest when you're stronger." She closed her eyes. He stayed in the chair until he was sure she was under, and then he put another piece of wood on the fire and sat back and watched the shadows move on the ceiling, and thought about Richard Vane, and thought about a man who left a woman in a field and walked away unhurried, his hands already clean. He thought about that for a long time. The morning after the fever broke, Elena tried to sit up on her own and made it about halfway before the ribs said no, in a language that didn't leave room for argument. Caleb was in the doorway with a cup of coffee when it happened. He watched her jaw tighten, watched her hold completely still the way you did when the pain was the kind that moving made worse, and he crossed the room and set the coffee on the nightstand and said, "Let me," and put his arm behind her shoulders and helped her up to sitting, slow, incrementally, until she was upright against the headboard and breathing in the shallow, careful way of someone with damaged ribs who had learned what depth of breath cost. "Thank you," she said, through her teeth. "You were going to do it yourself," he said. "I was getting there." "I know." He picked up the coffee and held it out to her. "Doc Harlan's coming this afternoon. He'll want to check the ribs again." She took the cup, held it with both hands, not drinking yet, just holding it like the warmth was the point. She looked out the window at the thin November light coming sideways across the fields, and something in her face was different from the night before. Less fever-slack, more watchful. More like herself, he was beginning to understand, which meant more guarded. "I've been thinking," she said. "About what?" "About how long I've been here." She looked at the coffee. "It's been almost 4 days. 3.5. That's long enough for word to travel." She finally took a sip. Caleb waited. "He has people everywhere, Caleb, not just hired men, people who talk. A storekeeper who sends notes. A deputy who takes money. A woman at the telegraph office in Billings who forwards anything with his name attached." She looked up at him. "I don't know how far we are from Billings. 60 miles, give or take." "Then he already knows I'm alive," she said, "or he suspects it. He's not a man who leaves things to chance." Caleb pulled the chair up and sat down. "You said that yesterday." "I meant it yesterday, too." "I heard you," he said. "I've been thinking about it." She looked at him with that careful, measuring look, the one he was getting used to, the one that said she was not going to take anything on faith if she could help it. He didn't take that personally. He was starting to understand that it wasn't about him. "What have you been thinking?" she said. "That you're right that he'll come, that I'd rather know when he's coming than be surprised, and that you need another 3 weeks at least before those ribs are healed enough to do anything about anything." He sat back. "So the question isn't whether to run. You can't run. The question is what position we're in when he gets here." Elena was quiet for a moment. "You say that like you're planning to fight him." "I'm planning to not be caught flat-footed," he said. "There's a difference. He has lawyers, Caleb. He has money. He has people in territorial government who owe him favors. You're a rancher with 60 acres and a daughter. She said it without cruelty, just with the bluntness of someone who had learned that underestimating Richard Vane was a specific kind of mistake you only made once. 63 acres, Caleb said. She looked at him. He thought he saw the ghost of something in her expression. Not amusement exactly, but the space where amusement might have lived once, before things got the way they'd gotten. That changes everything, she said, dry as dust. Drink your coffee, he said. Harlan came at 2 in the afternoon and spent 20 minutes with Elena while Caleb waited in the kitchen with Lily, who was attempting to make something from a recipe in a book that had belonged to Agnes, and which was written in Agnes's handwriting, small and slanted, the kind of handwriting that was personal enough to hurt to look at directly. Lily had flour on her sleeve and a focused expression. "What are you making?" Caleb said. "Biscuits." She didn't look up. "For Miss Ellie." Miss Ellie. That's what I'm calling her. She measured something inexact into the bowl. "She doesn't mind. I asked." "When did you ask?" "This morning, when you were outside." She looked up briefly. "She said her mother used to call her Ellie. She said it was okay." She looked back at the bowl. She looked sad when she said it, but she smiled too, both at once. Caleb sat down at the table and didn't say anything for a moment. "She has people she came from," Lily said, matter-of-factly, working the dough. "She told me her mother died when she was 12, and she doesn't have brothers or sisters, just like me." She paused. "Almost like me. I have you." "You do," Caleb said. "She doesn't have anybody," Lily said. She said it as a simple fact, without drama, the way she said things that she'd thought through carefully. "That's why we have to be her people now." Caleb looked at his daughter, at the flour on her sleeve and the serious face and the 2 small hands working the dough with more determination than technique, and felt something that sat behind his sternum and had no clean name. "You're 6, he said. "I know how old I am," Lily said. Harlan came out of the room with his bag and his expression professionally neutral, which Caleb had learned over the years meant something worth discussing. "The ribs are set right," he said, in the kitchen, low. "She didn't move enough in the fever to displace them, which is lucky. The bruising is coming along." He set his bag on the table. "She's got older injuries too, not recent. A shoulder that healed crooked, been broken before, probably not treated properly. Couple of her fingers, same story." He looked at Caleb. "This has been going on a while." "I know," Caleb said. "She tell you about him?" "Some." "Richard Vane." Harlan said the name like he was identifying a species of something unpleasant. "I've heard that name. Territory business, a few years back. He had a land claim dispute with 3 families east of Billings. All 3 of them ended up leaving, settled elsewhere." He picked up his bag. "Nobody proved anything." "Nobody usually does," Caleb said. "No," Harlan agreed. "They don't." He paused. "She needs 3 more weeks of rest, minimum. After that she could travel if she had to. Slow travel, nothing dramatic. Before that," he shook his head. "Before that, moving her hard could puncture something. I won't soften that." "I'm not asking you to." Harlan looked at him steadily. "You understand what you've taken on here." "She needed help," Caleb said, for the second time, to the second person who'd asked a version of that question. He was starting to wonder how many more times he'd need to say it before it stopped needing to be said. Harlan nodded slowly. "All right," he said, "keep the dressing on the shoulder changed every 2 days. Broth, real food, when she can manage it. She's going to be sore for a while even when the ribs are healed. That's normal. Don't let her push too hard too fast." He started toward the door, then stopped. "She's a sensible woman. You can be honest with her about the timeline." "She already knows the timeline," Caleb said. "She told me." Harlan almost smiled. "I suspected that," he said. The first week settled into a shape that none of them had designed, but that seemed to fit together anyway, the way necessary things sometimes did on a working ranch where there was too much to do to waste time on arrangements. Caleb did the morning chores while Lily had breakfast and took a plate to Elena's room. This had happened once by accident, Lily carrying her own plate and then deciding Elena shouldn't eat alone, and then became routine, the way Lily's decisions about how things should work tended to become routine. Caleb had learned not to argue with the underlying logic, even when the process was chaotic. Elena, for her part, did not particularly know what to do with a 6-year-old who had decided to adopt her. He observed this from the doorway sometimes, on his way past, the two of them at the small table by the window, Lily talking about something in the thorough and nonlinear way she had, Elena listening with an expression that was somewhere between uncertain and absorbed. Elena asked questions occasionally, real ones, the way adults sometimes forgot to ask children, and Lily answered them with the seriousness of someone being properly consulted, and the whole arrangement was clearly doing something for both of them that Caleb couldn't have orchestrated if he'd tried. What he noticed about Elena in those first days, she was not a woman who accepted help easily. She would do things herself until she couldn't, and then she would sit with the frustration of not being able to do them, and then, if he made the offer plainly enough and without ceremony, she would accept it. But there was always the moment in between, the pause, the recalibration. He began to understand that every time someone helped her, she was running a calculation she couldn't turn off. What does this cost? What does it mean? What will be expected in return? The calculation was exhausting to watch. He wondered how exhausting it was to run. "You don't have to earn it," he said one afternoon, when he'd come in to find her trying to fold a blanket with her arms, and making a poor job of it because the ribs wouldn't let her extend fully, and she'd refused his first offer and was now clearly regretting the refusal. She looked at him. "What?" "Whatever it is you think you need to do to stay here, you don't have to earn it." He took the blanket, folded it in 4 motions, set it at the foot of the bed. "You're hurt. You need somewhere to be while you heal. That's all this is." Elena looked at the folded blanket for a moment. "That's easy to say," she said. "I know. You don't know what it's like to owe someone." "I've owed people," he said, "and I've been owed. Neither one of them feels the way you think it will." She was quiet for a moment. Outside, the wind was moving across the fields, and through the window the sky had the flat gray look of snow thinking about arriving. "Richard used to say things like that," she said. "Flat, informational. That it wasn't about owing, that he was just helping." She paused. "Then later he'd remind me what the help had cost him." Caleb stood there with that for a moment. "I'm not Richard Vane," he said. "No," she said, and looked at him. "I can see that. I'm still—" She stopped, seemed to look for a word and not quite find one. "Working on the knowing of it, the feeling of it. The knowing and the feeling aren't the same thing." "I know," he said, and let it go at that, because some things didn't need more words around them. Check. 12 days after they'd found her, Elena came out of the room on her own. Caleb was at the kitchen table with the ranch accounts, which were not particularly cheerful reading, when he heard the slow, deliberate footsteps in the hall and looked up. She was in the doorway, one hand on the frame, dressed in clothes that were not quite her size. Lily had gone through a trunk and found things that had belonged to Agnes, which was a different, complicated feeling that Caleb had set aside for later. And she looked pale and careful and determined. "You're supposed to be resting," he said. "I've been resting for 12 days, she said. "I'll lose my mind." He pushed back from the table. "Sit down before you fall down." "I'm not going to fall down." "You're swaying." She held still and apparently confirmed to herself that she was, in fact, swaying slightly, and then crossed to the table and sat down in the chair across from him with a dignity that only wobbled a little. "Better?" he said. "Don't," she said, but there was something in it that wasn't quite irritation. He went and poured her coffee and brought it back and sat down. She looked at the account book spread on the table, columns of numbers in his handwriting, and he watched her eyes move across them with the quick comprehension of someone who understood figures. "How bad is it?" she said. "It's fine." She looked at him. "It's not good," he said. "It's not bad enough to lose anything, but the market was poor this fall, and the fence damage cost more than I budgeted." He closed the ledger. "It's fine." "You said fine twice," she said. "That means it's not fine." He looked at her. She looked back at him. He opened the ledger again. "Last 3 years have been tight," he said. "Agnes's illness cost a lot, and I didn't have much in reserve. I've been rebuilding." He looked at the numbers without seeing them. "I'm about 18 months from where I want to be. It's manageable." He closed it again. "See? Fine." 18 months is a long time on a frontier ranch, she said. "It is," he agreed. "But I know this land and I know the cattle, and I've got one more season to make up the difference. I've made up bigger differences." He looked at her. "I'm not asking for sympathy." "I'm not offering it," she said. And there was something in that, something that was a little more direct, a little less careful than the way she'd been speaking to him before, like some small threshold had been crossed. I was doing the math. Why? She held the coffee cup, looked at it. I was good with accounts, she said carefully, like she was moving something from a shelf she hadn't touched in a while. Before, my father ran a lumber business in Ohio. I kept his books from the time I was 14. It was something I was good at. Was? He said. Richard didn't see the point of it, she said. After a while, I didn't either. It's easier not to want things than to keep wanting them when you can't have them. Caleb didn't say anything. Anyway, she said, I'm just saying, if you wanted another set of eyes on those numbers, I can see from here that your timber costs last quarter were higher than necessary. You're paying the alderman rate, and the Henderson yard undercuts them by about 8%. He looked at her for a moment. Then he picked up the ledger and slid it across the table to her. She looked at it, then at him, like she was waiting for the part where he took it back. He didn't take it back. She opened it. She found 4 places where he'd been overpaying and 2 where an invoice had been recorded twice. She pointed them out with the flat clarity of someone who was just reading what the numbers said. No performance, no look how smart I am, just here and here and here. He went through each one, verified them against the source receipts he kept in a box under the table, and confirmed that she was right on all 6. That's about $60, she said, over 8 months. $60 is a month's supply run, he said. I know. She didn't say anything else about it. She closed the ledger and pushed it back across to him, and he thought she looked a little like someone who had put on a pair of shoes that fit after wearing the wrong size for years, and she didn't know quite what to do with that feeling. Thank you, he said. She shrugged, which pulled at the ribs and made her go still for a moment. I told you not to do that, he said. I forgot. You forget things that cost you and remember everything that doesn't, he said, not unkindly. She looked at him with an expression he couldn't entirely read. Then Lily came through the back door in a coat 2 sizes too large and boots caked with the particular mud of the near corral, and the expression dissolved into something simpler. You're up, Lily said, like this was the best development of the week, which for Lily it probably was. She kicked her boots against the step and came inside, dropping the coat on the hook and coming straight to the table. Can you walk? How far can you walk? Did Daddy show you the garden? It's not much right now because it's November, but in spring it's really… Lily, Caleb said, I'm just asking. She just got to the kitchen. She hasn't walked to the garden yet. I could walk to the garden, Elena said. You could not, Caleb said. I could probably make it to the porch. In 3 days, he said. Elena looked at Lily. 3 days, she said, like they were agreeing on something. Lily nodded seriously. I'll show you everything, she said. The garden and the corral and where the owls live in the big cottonwood. There's 2 of them. I named them. She considered. You'll probably think the names are silly. What are the names? Elena said. Margaret and Theodore. Elena looked at her for a moment. Those are very serious names for owls. They're very serious owls, Lily said with complete dignity. Caleb looked down at his account book and did not smile, or at least did not let the smile out of his face, because Lily would take it the wrong way. 3 days later, Elena made it to the porch. It was a gray afternoon, cold but not windy, and she sat on the bench with a quilt around her shoulders and looked at the fields and the low line of the hills to the north. And Caleb came out and stood near the railing with his coffee, and neither of them said anything for a while. This was something he'd noticed, that she didn't feel the need to fill silence, which was unusual. Most people filled silence because empty space felt like something that needed correcting. Elena seemed to understand that some silences were just things you sat in for a while. It's beautiful country, she said, finally. I grew up about 20 miles east of here, he said. Different terrain, but the same kind of sky. He looked at the horizon. Agnes thought the sky was the best part. She said there was nowhere else she'd seen it that size. She was right, Elena said. He looked at her sideways. She was looking at the sky, and the light was going that particular direction it went in late November, low and amber and thin, and she looked tired, but a different kind of tired than she'd looked 2 weeks ago. 2 weeks ago, she'd looked wrung out. Now she looked like someone who'd been sleeping. Can I ask you something? She said. Go ahead. The night you found me. She kept looking at the sky. You didn't know who I was. You didn't know what was coming with me. You didn't know anything about Richard. She paused. And you brought me home anyway. I did. Why didn't you take me to town, to the sheriff, somewhere official? She wasn't accusing, just genuinely asking. That's what most people would do. Caleb thought about it. Closest sheriff is in Mill Haven. That's 9 miles. It was October and the temperature was dropping and you were... He stopped, started again. You were not in a condition to make 9 miles, and I wasn't sure... He stopped again. I wasn't sure what you'd get in Mill Haven that you'd want. The sheriff there is a decent man, but he isn't the kind who asks a lot of questions. He takes the path of least trouble, Elena said. Usually. She nodded slowly. And the path of least trouble with a woman in that condition and a wealthy man who says she belongs to him is usually to give her back. That was my thought, Caleb said. She was quiet. He heard the sound of Lily somewhere in the barn, talking to the horses in the way she did, the rising and falling cadence of a child who believed animals understood sentences. I have to tell you something, Elena said. He turned to look at her. She was looking at her hands on the quilt edge, not at him. He has a letter. Richard does. A letter from 2 years ago that I wrote, that he made me write, that says I have a condition, a mental condition, that I sometimes go off in a state of confusion and don't remember it afterward. She said it carefully, like something she'd been practicing saying. He's used it before. When I tried to leave the first time, he went to his lawyer with it, and the lawyer went to a judge and... She stopped. It makes anything I say suspect, any story I tell, any accusation I make. Caleb was quiet. He'll use it here, she said. He'll come here and he'll be calm and polite and he'll say he's worried about his wife and he'll show them the letter and he'll say he just wants to take me home where I can be cared for. She looked up at him. And it will sound very reasonable. What's the lawyer's name? Caleb said. She looked at him. Why? Because I'd like to know what I'm dealing with before it's standing in my yard. A pause. Heaton, she said. Martin Heaton. Billings. He filed it. All right. Caleb. She said his name carefully, like she was making sure he was paying full attention. I want you to understand, I'm not saying this to make you afraid, or to make you feel like you have to do something. She looked at him directly. I'm saying it because you deserve to know the full picture, and because I won't... She stopped, seemed to need to recalibrate. I won't let anyone come into your home and use what they know against you without having given you the chance to know it first. He looked at her for a long moment. That's a fair thing, he said. I'm trying to be fair. I know you are. He turned back to look at the fields. So, what's in that letter? It was coerced. Yes, but proving that there are other things that prove a person's mind is sound, he said. The account books are one of them. He glanced at her. $60 across 8 months, found in 20 minutes. A woman with a confused mind doesn't find $60 in an account book in 20 minutes. Elena looked at him for a moment. That's not how it works in a courtroom, she said. No, he agreed. But it's how it works with the kind of men who live and work in a place, the kind who see a thing and know what it means. He looked at the horizon. Richard Vane has lawyers. I have neighbors, and neighbors in this part of the territory know things that don't get written down in letters. She was quiet for a long time. You're not afraid of him, she said, and it was not quite a statement and not quite a question. I'm cautious of him, Caleb said. That's different. He finished his coffee. A man who isn't afraid of anything is usually just a man who hasn't been paying attention. I've been paying attention. The light was going now, the amber thinning toward gray, and the temperature was dropping with it, and he was about to say they should go in when she spoke again. I don't know how to do this, she said, very quiet. Not how to fight him. I mean, she paused. I don't know how to be somewhere and not be waiting for it to go wrong. I don't know how to take a thing at face value. I don't know how to... She stopped. It used to be easy, being with people, trusting people. I used to be... She seemed to reach for a word. Easier than this. He looked at her. She was looking at her hands again, and there was something in her face that was neither self-pity nor stoicism, but somewhere between them. The place where a person lived when they were being honest about something they didn't much like being honest about. You just found $60 I didn't know I was missing, he said. A woman who's been completely broken doesn't do that. She looked up. Whatever he took, Caleb said, he didn't get all of it. She held his gaze for a moment. Something in her face shifted, just slightly, the way things shifted sometimes when a person heard something they needed to hear and hadn't known they were waiting for it. Then she looked away, and the moment was over, and the cold was real. We should go in, she said. We should, he said. He held the door and she went inside, and Lily came out of the barn at a run because she'd heard voices and didn't want to miss anything. And the evening closed down over the ranch in the way evenings did on the Montana plains, fast and dark and total, with the stars beginning above the hills and the fire going inside, and the cold outside as honest and complete as everything else out here. Somewhere to the south, 60 miles in closing, Richard Vane knew she was alive. He had not yet moved. But the kind of man who didn't slam doors, who spoke in the same flat tone at the table and in the dark, that kind of man did not let things go. He arranged them. He waited until the arrangement was right. And then he moved, unhurried, his hands already clean, his lawyers already briefed, his story already polished to a shine. He was coming. The only question was how much time they had. The snow came on a Thursday, 3 weeks after Elena had first made it to the porch. It came the way Montana's snow came in December. Not gradually, not as a suggestion, but as a fact that the sky had decided on and was now delivering without apology. Caleb had seen it in the clouds the day before, that particular flat ceiling that meant business, and he'd spent Wednesday getting the cattle into the lower pasture and checking the water lines and splitting enough wood to last a week if the cold held. Elena had watched him from the kitchen window most of the afternoon, and when he came in for supper, she had a pot of something hot on the stove that she'd managed without being asked, moving carefully around the kitchen with the particular economy of motion she'd developed. Nothing wasted, nothing that stressed the ribs, everything deliberate. The ribs were 3 weeks along now, and healing, but not healed, and she still moved like someone who had learned not to trust her body's first instincts. You didn't have to do that, he said, dropping his coat. I know, she said, and put a bowl in front of him, and that was that. Lily came in from her room where she'd been doing the reading she was supposed to do and immediately sat down and looked in the pot and said, What is it? And Elena said, Beef and turnips. And Lily considered this and said, Is it good? And Elena said, I don't know yet. I made it. And Lily considered that too and said, I'll try it, in the tone of someone doing a favor. And Elena said, I appreciate this sacrifice, without inflection. And Lily laughed, a real laugh, sudden and bright. And Caleb sat down and thought about how long it had been since he'd heard that sound over supper. The beef and turnips were fine, not remarkable, but hot and real, and Elena ate more than she had any previous night, which he noted without comment. The snow started after dark, and by morning it was 6 inches and still going. But the first time Richard Vane's name came up in town, Caleb was at the feed store. It was the second week of December, a clear day between storms, and he'd gone into Harlan's Creek. The town was named for the doctor's father, a point of local pride that Doc Harlan bore with minimal grace, for supply goods and to pick up mail. He was at the counter at Purdy's feed store with a list when Tom Purdy, who was 58 and had not learned the art of indirect conversation, looked up from the ledger and said, Here you've got a woman staying out at your place. Caleb looked up. Where'd you hear that? Word gets around. Tom Purdy did not say this apologetically. It was simply the nature of things. Also, Frank Alderman's boy said he saw Doc Harlan's horse at your place twice in 1 week, which Frank Alderman's boy tells Frank Alderman, and Frank Alderman is not what you'd call discreet. She was hurt, Caleb said. We found her on the North Creek. She needed somewhere to heal. She got a name? Caleb put his list on the counter. Elena, he said. You going to fill this order, or are we talking? Purdy looked at the list, began pulling from the shelves without further questions, which was a form of respect in its way. But after 2 minutes, he said without looking up, A man came through Tuesday, came into town asking if anyone knew of a woman fitting a particular description. Dark hair, late 20s, might have been injured, said she was his wife, said she'd had an episode. Caleb's hands on the counter didn't move. What kind of man? He said. Well-dressed. 2 men with him, not well-dressed, but the kind of not well-dressed that means working muscle, not ordinary poor. Purdy set a sack of grain on the counter. Polite, very polite. Had a paper he showed around. Said it was from a doctor. He looked at Caleb then, direct, as Tom Purdy tended to be. Did any of that polite talk land anywhere? What did people say? Said they didn't know anything. Purdy went back to the shelves, which for the most part was true. Not many people knew about your situation. He paused. I didn't say anything either, in case you were wondering. Caleb exhaled slowly. I appreciate that. I'm not doing you a favor, Purdy said. I'm doing her one. I've seen what that kind of polite looks like when it stops being polite. My wife's sister had a husband like that once. We don't talk about it much. He dropped a smaller sack on the counter. But I'll tell you this. He left a name at the hotel and said he'd be back through in a week. Man named Vane. I know, Caleb said. Purdy looked at him steadily. How long have you known? Since she woke up. They looked at each other across the counter for a moment. You got a plan? Purdy said. Working on one, Caleb said. He didn't tell Elena about the visit right away. He thought about it on the ride home, the cold working at his face and the horse moving steady through the snow-packed road. And he went back and forth on it in the way he did with difficult things. Not avoiding, just making sure he had his footing before he opened the door. By the time he got home, he'd decided. She'd told him she wouldn't let anyone come onto his land armed with what they knew without giving him the chance to know it first. He owed her the same. He found her in the front room, sitting at the small desk by the window that had been Agnes's, with the ranch account books open and a piece of paper beside her covered in notes. She'd been doing this the last several days, reorganizing his records, finding patterns, suggesting adjustments, with a thoroughness that would have been excessive if the underlying math hadn't been so consistently useful. He'd stopped pretending he could argue with the math. She looked up when he came in. She read something in his face because she had become good at reading faces in the particular way that people became good at things that kept them safe. She put down the pen. Tell me, she said. He told her. The man at the feed store. The paper. The week's timeline. She listened without interrupting. Her face did the thing it did when she was holding something still inside, but not blank, but controlled, like a surface that was doing a lot of work underneath. When he finished, she looked at the window. A week, she said. Could be sooner. Could be he's watching and he knows I went to town today. Caleb sat down in the chair across from her. He might have someone here already. I don't know. She nodded slowly, absorbing this. He'll come with the paper. The letter about my condition. Purdy said it looked like a doctor's certification. It is a doctor's certification, she said. Richard has a doctor in his pocket, man named Fell. He does what Richard pays him to do. She rubbed her fingers along the edge of the account book absently, not noticing she was doing it. The letter says I have episodes of what Dr. Fell calls fugue disorder, that I wander, that I become convinced I'm in danger when I'm not. She said it flatly, that I'm not a reliable reporter of my own experience. That's sophisticated, Caleb said. It wasn't a compliment. Richard is sophisticated, she said. He doesn't operate on brute force. He operates on systems, lawyers, paperwork, the right words said to the right people at the right time. She looked at him. He had 2 men with him? From the description. His regular men are Roy Casper and a man they call Dutch. Roy is the one who brought me back after I ran. He does what he's told. Dutch is worse because he enjoys it. She said this without flinching, which he understood was its own kind of cost. There will be more somewhere. Richard doesn't travel with only 2. Caleb sat with that for a moment. How long before you could travel, he said. She looked at him directly. If you're going to send me somewhere, I'm not, he said. I'm asking because I want to know what our options are. All of them, including that one. She held his gaze, then looked down at the account books. Doc Harlan said 3 weeks from when he last saw me. That's another 10 days, roughly. Too long, Caleb said. I know. If you moved now, I'd be slow and in pain and not particularly useful if something went wrong. She said it without drama. And I'd be alone, and I don't know this country well enough to know where to go. She paused. I thought about it. I thought about it quite a bit. Going before he came, saving you the trouble. She looked at him. But I kept coming back to the same problem. Which is? I've run twice, she said. Both times he caught me. And each time I ran, he had more evidence for the letter. More evidence that I was unstable, that I fled without reason, that I couldn't be trusted to know my own mind. Her voice was level, but there was something under it, something that had the particular temperature of old rage. Running is what he expects. Running gives him what he wants. He spent 3 years making me into a woman who runs. The room was quiet. Outside, the wind moved against the windows. "So you stay," Caleb said. "I stay," she said. "And we do this differently." He looked at her. "What does differently look like?" She picked up the pen. She had been thinking about this too, he realized, for more than a day, probably since he'd left for town this morning, and she'd been sitting here at this desk with the quiet and the accounts and whatever went on in her mind when there was nothing to distract it. "He'll come here and he'll say I'm his wife and I'm unwell and he wants to take me home," she said. "He'll be polite. He'll have the letter. He'll have his lawyer if Martin Heaton has come up from Billings, and I'd expect he has." She wrote something. "What he won't expect is that I'm not hiding. What he won't expect is witnesses." Witnesses to what? To me. She looked up. To the account books and the conversations and the 3 weeks I've been here. To the woman he says can't account for her own experience, accounting for his expenses down to the penny and finding his errors. She held the pen. A confused woman who wanders in fugue states doesn't do 3 weeks of ranch accounting, but someone needs to say so, credibly. Caleb thought about Tom Purdy and what he'd said about his wife's sister. Who would say so? "People who've seen me," she said. "Doc Harlan, you, Lily. Not Lily, she's too young, a judge wouldn't weigh it. But anyone else who's been here and talked to me." She paused. "And I need to write to someone." "Who?" "I had a lawyer in Ohio," she said, "before I married Richard. My father used him for the lumber business. He's old, but he's still practicing. His name is August Freer." She looked at the desk. "I wrote to him once. When things started going badly, I thought—" She stopped. "Richard found the letter before I sent it. That was a bad night." She said it quietly, not seeking anything from him, just noting the fact. "But August Freer doesn't know Richard. He owes Richard nothing, and he knows me from when I was—" She paused again. "From before. He knows what I was like before." "Can you get a letter to him without Richard intercepting it?" "Not through the Billings telegraph office," she said. "But Purdy's store? You said he didn't tell Richard anything." "He didn't." "Does he have a way to send mail that doesn't go through Billings?" Caleb thought about it. "He sends his personal mail through the Henderson postal station. It goes a different route, takes longer." "How much longer?" 2 weeks to get there, 2 weeks back," she calculated. "That could still work, if he moves fast. If he has someone here in time—" She paused, and he could see her doing the math, the way she did everything, practical and precise. No cushioning. "It's a long shot, but it's better than nothing." "Write the letter," he said. She was already writing. Caleb rode to Purdy's the next morning before the sun was properly up and came back with a commitment and a handshake that meant what handshakes in that part of the country were supposed to mean. He also came back with something he hadn't gone for. Tom Purdy had sent him home with the information that 2 of Vane's men had been seen the night before at the saloon in Harlan's Creek, sitting at a corner table, not drinking much, watching the room. He told Elena. She put down her coffee cup. "They're already here." "Watching to see who comes and goes," he said. She was quiet for a moment. "He wants to know your habits before he comes himself. That's how he operates. He observes first. He doesn't like to walk into anything he hasn't already mapped." "Then he knows I went to Purdy's." "Yes." "And he'll know someone went with my mail," Caleb said. "He might not know it was for me," Elena said. "He'll suspect, but he won't know for certain. He'll wait to see if something comes back before he moves." She pressed her lips together. "That buys us time. Not much, but some." Caleb picked up his coffee. "What do you need me to do?" "I need you to keep going about your business," she said, "exactly as you have been. Nothing unusual, nothing that looks like preparation." She looked at him. "And I need you to invite the neighbors." He looked at her. "For what?" "Harlan, the aldermans, Tom Purdy, and his wife." She put her hand flat on the desk. "Not a meeting, not anything formal, just neighbors coming by, the way neighbors do. If Richard's man is watching, he sees a rancher and his neighbors and his house guest who is clearly not being hidden. She paused. I want to be seen, not hiding, not running, just here, normally. He's going to read that as confidence, Caleb said. Good, she said, because that's what it is. He looked at her for a long moment. 3 weeks ago, she'd been lying in the grass by a frozen creek with barely enough left to move her fingers. And here she was, mapping a counter-strategy against a man with lawyers and money and hired muscle, with the same quality of focus she brought to a set of account books. Methodical, clear-eyed, no performance. All right, he said, I'll send word to Frank Alderman today. The gathering happened 2 days later, on a Saturday, when the sky was gray and still, and the temperature had lifted just enough that being outside wasn't a punishment. The Aldermans came, Frank and his wife Dorothy, and their 2 older boys who had work to do and didn't stay long. Tom Purdy came with his wife Margaret, who was a quick-eyed woman of 60, who took one look at Elena and said, You're the one they've been asking about. And Elena said, I imagine I am. And Margaret Purdy sat down next to her at the kitchen table and said, Tell me what happened, in a voice that made it clear she was not asking out of gossip. So Elena told her. Not everything, not the worst of it, but enough. The measured version, the legal version, the version that was organized and clear and didn't ask for anything except to be heard. Margaret Purdy listened without interrupting. When Elena was done, Margaret sat for a moment and then said, My husband mentioned the letter, the one that says you're confused. Yes. Are you confused? No. I didn't think so. Margaret looked at her with a directness that was almost startling. I'm going to tell you something. There's a judge in the territory. His name is Aldous Crane, and he rides the Eastern Circuit. He comes through Harlan's Creek twice a year. He was here in October, and he'll be back in March. She paused. He is not a man who likes Richard Vane. Elena went still. You know Crane? My husband did some survey work for his family 20 years ago. We've kept the acquaintance. Margaret looked at her steadily. He's not someone you can buy. Richard has probably already discovered that. That's why he wants this settled before March, Elena said, half to herself. That would be my reading of it, Margaret said. So whatever you're doing, it needs to work well enough to hold until Crane comes through. Caleb, from the other side of the room, had been listening without appearing to. He caught Elena's eyes briefly across the room, and she held his look for a moment that said, This is the piece I didn't have, and filed it away. Doc Harlan arrived later, with the patient persistence of a man who went where he was needed and did not require a formal reason. He sat with the group for a while, and then pulled Caleb aside and said, Lo, I got a message. Man named Heaton, Billings. He sent a formal inquiry to my office asking about a patient. Didn't use her name, but described her age and physical condition. What did you say? Nothing yet. I wanted to talk to you first. He looked at Caleb. Professionally, I have obligations about patient information. Practically, I have obligations to a woman whose husband left her to die in a field. He was quiet a moment. Those 2 things are going to require some careful navigating. What do you need from me? I need to know what we're doing, Harlan said, so I can do it correctly. Caleb told him about the letter to August Freer, about Judge Crane in March, about the plan, such as it was. Not confrontation, but positioning, getting the right people into the right places before Richard Vane arrived with his polished version of events. Harlan listened with the stillness of a man who'd heard a lot of difficult things and knew which ones required urgency and which ones required care. When Caleb was done, he said, I can delay my response to Heaton on procedural grounds. Takes him 2 weeks to follow up through proper channels. That buys you a little. A little is something, Caleb said. A little is usually what you get, Harlan said. Awesome. Lily, throughout all of this, was not entirely unaware. She was 6, but she was Lily, and Lily had learned early to read the temperature of rooms. She knew something was being prepared for in the way adults moved and talked in lower voices, and went quiet when she came in. She didn't like being gone around, but she was also practical enough to understand that some things were not for children until they had to be. What she did, in her own way, was watch Elena. She watched the way Elena sat at the desk and worked. She watched the way Elena moved around the kitchen more easily now, the careful motion becoming a little less careful each day, the ribs knitting themselves back to something functional. She watched the way Elena was with the adults who came on Saturday. Not submissive, not performing, just present and direct and honest, the way Lily thought people should be. On Sunday morning, she came and sat across from Elena at the kitchen table with her breakfast and said, without preamble, "Is someone coming to take you away?" Elena looked at her. "You can tell me," Lily said. "I'm not a baby." "I know you're not," Elena said. "So is someone coming?" Elena put down her coffee. She looked at Lily with the particular attention she gave her. Not simplified, not over-explanatory, just direct. "Someone might come," she said. "A man who thinks he has the right to say where I go." Lily absorbed this. "Does he?" "No," Elena said, "but he thinks he does, which is almost the same problem." Lily considered this for a long moment, with the spoon moving around in her bowl in small circles. "Is he bad?" "Yes." "Like really bad or just regular bad?" "Really bad," Elena said. "The kind that doesn't look it. The kind that seems fine from the outside." Lily nodded slowly. "Those are the worst kind," she said, with the certainty of someone who had formed the opinion carefully. "They are," Elena agreed. "What happens if he comes?" Elena looked at her for a moment. "I think your father and I are trying to make sure we're ready, so that if he comes, we're in a better position than we would be if we weren't ready." "And then he can't take you?" "Then it's harder for him to take me," Elena said. "Legally, and with the people here." She paused. "I can't promise you an outcome, Lily. I don't know how it's going to go." Lily seemed to appreciate this more than she would have appreciated a false reassurance. She nodded again, seriously. "Okay," she said. "That's honest." "I try to be." Lily ate a spoonful of porridge. "I'd be very upset," she said, "if he took you. I want you to know that." Elena looked at her for a moment. Something crossed her face. Not the almost smile, not the wall. Something more exposed than either of those. Something that didn't have armor on it. "I know," Elena said quietly. "I would be too." The snow came back on Wednesday, and with it came Roy Casper. He didn't come to the house. He came to the edge of the property, just inside the tree line at the north end, where the road bent around a stand of cottonwoods, and he sat on his horse in the gray morning light and watched the ranch for an hour before Caleb saw him. Caleb saw him from the barn. He stood just inside the barn door and watched the man at the tree line watch his house, and he kept his face ordinary and went about the business of the barn, and when he came inside he told Elena. She stood at the stove and her face did not change. "He's not coming to threaten," she said. "He's coming to confirm. To confirm you're here. And to see the layout, who comes and goes, whether you've done anything to prepare." She turned from the stove. "Richard is ready to move. Roy wouldn't be here if he wasn't close." "How close?" "Days," she said. "Maybe less." She looked at him. "You need to get word to Tom Purdy. See if the letter has gone out." "I sent it 5 days ago." "Then it's too late to wait for August Freer," she said, and said it without flinching, because she was the kind of person who said things that were true, even when the truth was that the option she'd counted on was gone. "We can't wait for Crane in March. Richard will have me out of the territory before March." The kitchen was warm and quiet, and outside the snow was thickening again. "Then what?" Caleb said. She was quiet for a moment, not panicked, thinking. "What do people here do," she said slowly, "when someone comes onto a man's land and tries to take something that isn't his?" Caleb looked at her. "They stand their ground," he said. "That's what we do then," she said. "We stand it." She looked him straight in the eye. "I'm not running, Caleb. I'm done running. If he comes here, I want to be standing in your yard with my spine straight and my mind clear and every piece of paper we have, and I want whoever he brings with him to see that." She paused. "I want him to see that." "He's got men," Caleb said. "So do you," she said. "Frank Alderman has 2 boys and a shotgun, and no love for wealthy men who come into his valley acting like they own it. Tom Purdy has been watching Richard's hired men drink in his town for a week, and doesn't like it. Doc Harlan has been quietly furious since I came through his examination." She held his gaze. "You're not alone either. You just haven't asked." Who had come on Saturday and said nothing particular but stayed 3 hours and had the look of a man committing things to memory. He thought about Tom Purdy's handshake, which had meant what it meant. He thought about Margaret Purdy and Judge Crane and the way the pieces had been quietly assembling for 2 weeks without him fully naming them as what they were. "You've been doing this longer than I have," he said. "I've had 3 weeks of doing not much else," she said. and a long time before that of learning how Richard operates. He sat down at the kitchen table. "Tell me everything," he said. "Everything about how he operates. Every lever, every person, every paper, all of it." She pulled out the chair across from him and sat down, and outside the snow built on the window ledge in inches, and somewhere south of them Richard Vane was giving instructions to Roy Casper and Martin Heaton and Dutch, and the whole machinery of his particular kind of power was turning over and moving north. But inside the kitchen, Elena Whitmore laid out everything she knew, piece by piece, methodically, the way she worked an account book. Nothing hidden, nothing softened, all of it available and clear. And Caleb listened, and the hours went by. And when Lily came downstairs and found them at the table, surrounded by notes and papers, she looked at both of them for a moment and then went and made herself breakfast without asking, because she knew something important was happening, and she had learned at 6 years old that sometimes the most useful thing you could do was stay out of the way. By evening, they had something close to a plan. It was not a comfortable plan. It relied on people doing what they'd suggested they might do, and on Richard Vane moving on a timeline that matched what they expected, and on Elena being right about how he operated, which she believed she was, but belief and certainty were different things. It relied on Caleb's neighbors being the kind of neighbors he thought they were. And it relied on something else, something neither of them said aloud, which was that Elena needed to hold herself together when Richard arrived, and she was standing in the yard looking at the man who had broken her ribs and left her to die in a field. She needed to hold herself together and be exactly what she'd said, spine straight, mind clear, no sign of the woman who had lain in the grass counting seconds because counting was all she had left. She knew she could do it. She had been managing things she couldn't do for years. But knowing that and feeling it were different things, and she lay in bed that night and listened to the snow against the windows and listened to the house settle around her, the small, ordinary sounds of a place that was inhabited and alive. And she thought about the last time she'd felt safe somewhere, really safe, bone-deep safe. And she had to go back so far to find it that she was almost surprised to realize she'd ever felt it at all. Then she thought about Lily's face at the breakfast table. "I'd be very upset if he took you," said so plainly, so simply. The way children said the truest things, without architecture, without defense. She closed her eyes. She had been a woman with nowhere to go, and she had ended up here, in a house with a man who slid ledger books across tables and a little girl who named owls Margaret and Theodore. And it was the kind of accident that you couldn't have planned and couldn't have predicted, the kind that came out of the worst things and made you understand that worst things were not always the last things. Richard was coming, but she was not the woman he'd left in the grass. That woman had lain still and waited for the end. This one had plans. Richard Vane arrived on a Friday morning, 2 days after Roy Casper had sat at the tree line watching the ranch like a man taking inventory. He came with 4 horses and 3 men, which was more than he'd brought to town, and he came early, before the light was fully established, when the snow was still blue in the shadow of the hills, and the cold had the particular hard quality of early December mornings in Montana. He came the way he did everything, unhurried, arranged, nothing left to chance. Caleb saw them from the barn. He had been up since 4:30, which was earlier than usual, but not suspiciously so, because ranchers in winter kept odd hours, and the cattle didn't care what time a man had gone to bed. He told Elena the night before, "If they come, they'll come early." Men like Richard preferred to find people unprepared. They liked the advantage of a household still pulling itself together, still soft from sleep. Elena had been awake before him. He'd come downstairs at 4 and found her at the kitchen table with coffee already made and the lamp burning low and the account books open in front of her, though she wasn't reading them. She was just sitting with them, the way you sat with familiar things when you needed to feel like yourself. "You should sleep," he'd said. "I did sleep," she said. 4 hours. She looked up at him. "I always slept badly before something happened. Richard knew that too. He'd wait until I was tired to start an argument." She looked at the lamp. "I learned to sleep fast and light and be useful on 4 hours. It's not a skill I recommend acquiring." He'd poured himself coffee and sat across from her, and they'd gone over the plan one more time, not because it needed going over, but because saying things aloud in the last hours before they were tested was its own kind of preparation. The plan, such as it was, Frank Alderman and his 2 boys were coming at first light, ostensibly to look at a fence line on the shared property boundary. a plausible reason that Frank had suggested himself when Caleb had ridden over 2 days ago. Tom Purdy was coming with his wagon on the pretense of delivering a supply order that had been slightly wrong last week. Doc Harlan was coming because Doc Harlan had decided he was coming, and that was that. None of them were armed with anything except their presence and what they knew. It wasn't an army, it wasn't even much of a show of force, but it was witnesses, and witnesses were what changed the arithmetic of what Richard Vane could do in the open in front of people who lived here and would go on living here long after he left. That was the idea. Anyway, Caleb had spent the night aware of all the ways it could go wrong. Richard Vane was taller than Caleb had expected. He sat his horse well, which was the kind of detail that meant nothing except that he'd had money long enough to learn things that took money to learn. He wore a dark coat, good quality, and his hat was the kind that didn't carry trail dust the way a working man's hat did. Beside him rode Martin Heaton, who was smaller, thinner, and had the look of a man who spent his life in rooms with paperwork and was not comfortable in open weather. Behind them came Roy Casper and Dutch, and a fourth man Caleb didn't recognize, and all three of the men behind had the kind of stillness that was not peace but readiness. Caleb walked out of the barn when they were still 40 yards out. He didn't hurry. He didn't stop to get anything. He walked to the midpoint of his yard with his hands visible and his face ordinary and let them come to him because it was his land, and he was not going to run to meet them at his own gate. They stopped 10 feet out. Richard Vane looked at him with dark eyes that were, in fact, as flat and impersonal as Elena had described. He had a face that belonged in a bank or a government office, angular and controlled, the kind of face that had decided long ago not to give anything away for free. "Mr. Holloway," he said. His voice was exactly what Elena had said, unhurried, moderate in temperature. "Mr. Vane," Caleb said. A brief pause. Richard Vane recalibrated the situation in the space of a second. The fact that Caleb knew his name meant the element of surprise was already gone, and the fact that Caleb was standing in his yard at this hour, unrattled, meant something else was in play. Caleb watched all of that move through the man's eyes without touching his face. "I see my reputation precedes me," Richard said. "Word gets around," Caleb said. Same words Tom Purdy had used. He said them the same way, without apology, just as the nature of things. Richard looked at the house, at the barn, at the road behind Caleb that led to the fields. He was doing what Elena had said he did, mapping, assessing, looking for the shape of the situation before he committed to a direction within it. "I'm looking for my wife," he said. "I believe you may be able to help me." "Who's your wife?" Caleb said. "Her name is Elena Vane." He said it with a particular emphasis on the surname, gentle but deliberate. "Dark hair, late 20s, likely injured. She's been unwell. She has a condition that causes her to become confused and to make poor decisions about her own safety." He reached into his coat and produced a folded paper. "I have documentation from her physician." "I can read," Caleb said. He didn't reach for the paper. Martin Heaton shifted on his horse. Richard held the paper steady, still extended, still patient. "I'm simply concerned for her welfare," Richard said. "A woman in her condition, alone in winter. Anything could happen." "She's not alone," Caleb said. The smallest beat of silence. "So she is here," Richard said. "I didn't say that," Caleb said. Which was true. He had not said that. Richard lowered the paper slowly. He looked at Caleb with those flat, impersonal eyes, and Caleb looked back, and neither of them did anything with their faces. "Mr. Holloway," Richard said, with the measured patience of a man who had navigated this kind of situation before and expected to navigate it successfully again. "I don't want any trouble. I want my wife. She is legally my wife, whatever story she may have told you, and she has a documented medical history that explains some of the things she may have said. I'm simply asking for what is mine." "She's not a parcel," Caleb said. "I didn't say she was." "You said what is mine." Another pause. Caleb watched the recalibration happen again, fractionally, behind the flat eyes. "I misspoke," Richard said. "My concern is for her well-being." "Then you'll be relieved to hear she's been well taken care of," said a voice from behind Caleb. He had not heard Elena come out. He'd expected her. She'd said she was coming out. They'd agreed she would come out. But the sound of her voice came from closer than he'd expected, and he understood she'd come out the side door of the house and crossed to stand just behind his left shoulder, and she had done it quietly because she had spent years learning to move without drawing attention. He didn't turn. He kept his eyes on Richard, but he heard, in the silence that followed Elena's voice, the sound of Richard Vane's horse shift its weight slightly, a tiny adjustment that its rider communicated without meaning to, because Richard Vane was very controlled, but he was not in fact made of stone. So, she had dressed carefully that morning, not in Agnes's old clothes, which was what she'd been wearing. She'd asked Caleb the day before about the trunk in the hall, whether there was anything closer to her size, and he'd found one of Agnes's better dresses, a dark blue wool, and she'd altered it herself in the hours before dawn with a needle and thread from the sewing box, and the particular focus of someone who knew that appearance was its own form of argument. The dress fit her now, or nearly. She'd done her hair. She had slept on 4 hours and her ribs were not fully healed, and she had not looked in a mirror that morning because she didn't want to know how she looked, only how she stood. She stood straight. She had made herself a promise in the dark at 4 in the morning, listening to Caleb's footsteps on the stairs. She had made the promise in the way she made all the promises she actually kept, quietly, without ceremony, with a clear understanding of what it would cost. She was not going to let her voice shake. She walked up to stand beside Caleb, not behind him, and she looked at Richard Vane, and Richard Vane looked at her, and the morning held still around the both of them. He had not changed. That was the first thing. Some part of her had believed, irrationally, that something would have changed, that the months since she'd last seen him would have altered something. They hadn't. He was exactly as he had always been. The controlled face, the dark coat, the unhurried quality that was itself a kind of violence. "Elena," he said, mild, warm, almost. "Richard," she said, "you look well." He said it like a compliment, but his eyes moved over her the way they always had, reading her, cataloging, measuring the distance between who she was now and who he expected her to be. "I am well," she said. "Better than when you left me." A brief stillness, then, "I don't know what you mean by that." "I think you do," she said. "I think Roy and Dutch remember it clearly. I think it would be useful to ask them to describe it." Roy Casper, behind Richard, looked at a point somewhere above the horizon. Dutch looked at his horse's neck. Martin Heaton cleared his throat. "Mr. Holloway," he said, shifting the conversation with the practiced ease of a lawyer who kept one eye on where the exits were. "Perhaps we might discuss this in a more appropriate setting. My client simply wants assurance that his wife is—" "She's not his wife," Caleb said. Heaton blinked. "I beg your pardon?" "She may have been his wife-in-law," Caleb said. "But a man who leaves a woman for dead in a field in October has given up the standing to call himself a husband." He said it the way he said difficult things, plainly, without drama, as something that was simply true. "In this part of the territory, that's how it tends to work." "This part of the territory is governed by the same laws as the rest," Heaton said, with the precision of a man pulling out a measuring rod. "And those laws are clear regarding—" "Frank," Caleb said, without raising his voice or turning his head. Frank Alderman came around the side of the barn with his 2 oldest boys. Frank was 54 and had worked his land for 20 years and had a face like old leather and hands like tools. He stopped a few yards to the right of Caleb and stood there with his thumbs in his belt and looked at the men on horseback with the particular quality of someone who had already made up his mind and was not in the market for a better argument. "Morning," Frank said, to no one in particular. "Frank," Caleb said, "you remember what you told me last week about the woman at the creek?" "I do," Frank said. "My boy James was the one first saw her tracks. Said something dragged through the grass north of the Alderman markers. We didn't know what it was at the time. Now I think we do." He looked at Richard Vane, direct and unhurried. "My boy is 16. He's going to remember what he saw for a long time." There was a sound from the road, a wagon, Tom Purdy's distinctive double-wheeled rig, coming around the bend with Tom up on the seat and Margaret beside him in her good coat, because Margaret Purdy had decided that her good coat was appropriate for this kind of morning. Richard Vane watched the wagon approach. He looked at Frank Alderman. He looked at Caleb. His face did not change, but something behind it was making calculations, and Caleb could see the calculations happening even if he couldn't read them precisely. "You've arranged quite a gathering," Richard said. "It's a neighborly country," Caleb said. "Indeed." Richard looked at Elena. "Elena, Whatever these people have told you, whatever version of your own situation they've encouraged you to believe, you know what you are. You know what your condition is. You know what happens when you go off like this. He said it gently, not cruelly. Cruelly would have been easy to respond to. He said it with the gentle sadness of a man addressing someone whose judgment he'd learned not to trust. I'm not angry. I'm worried. That's all this is. Elena had known this was coming. She had known the exact tone and the exact form of the argument because she had lived inside it for 3 years and she knew every angle of it, the way you knew the furniture in a dark room you'd walked through 1,000 times. She had prepared for it. She had run through her response at 4 in the morning with the lamp burning and the account books open in front of her. It still took her a moment, not because she didn't have the words. Because standing in front of him and hearing his voice again was different from rehearsing it in a kitchen, and the body remembered things that the mind had organized and filed. Her ribs remembered. Her hands remembered. She made them stay still. Doc Harlan, she said, without looking away from Richard. Doc Harlan came through the front door of the house, where he'd been waiting since before sunrise, because he'd arrived before dawn, and Elena had let him in and given him coffee, and they'd sat at the kitchen table and she'd shown him the account books and the notes, and the papers she'd prepared over 3 weeks, and he'd read everything and said, when he was done, all right, just that, all right. And she'd understood what it meant. Harlan came to stand on her other side with a leather satchel under his arm and the reading glasses already on his face, which was something he did when he wanted to look official. And he looked at Martin Heaton with the mild, steady attention of a man who had been practicing medicine in this territory since before Heaton had passed the bar. I'm Dr. Samuel Harlan, he said. I've been this woman's treating physician for the past 3 weeks. I have documentation of her injuries upon arrival, her treatment, and her recovery. He opened the satchel. I also have documentation of older injuries consistent with repeated trauma over an extended period. He produced papers. 2 previously broken fingers, healed improperly. A shoulder fracture, healed crooked. Patterned bruising consistent with someone who has learned to protect their face. He looked at Heaton over the reading glasses. I'd be interested to see that medical certification you're carrying. Heaton looked at Richard. Richard looked at Harlan, still controlled, still flat. Whatever injuries she came to you with, doctor, her own history explains. She ran into things, Harlan said. Is that what her history explains? She is not well, Richard said. Her condition makes her... Her condition, Harlan said, is that she has 2 healing rib fractures, a bruised kidney, and defensive injuries on both hands. I've been practicing medicine for 37 years. I know the difference between a woman who is confused and a woman who has been hurt. He held the papers out to Heaton. You're welcome to read these. Heaton didn't take them. Tom Purdy had climbed down from the wagon and was standing with his wife, and Margaret was watching with her arms folded and her expression the expression of a woman who had made up her mind about something a long time ago. Tom said nothing. He didn't need to. He was 60 years old, and he had run the supply for the valley for 30 of those years, and he knew everyone here and they knew him, and his standing in this yard on this morning was itself a statement that didn't require words. Richard looked at Caleb. When he spoke, his voice had not changed in temperature, but there was something precise and cold in it now, the way a calm surface could be cold. You don't understand what you're involving yourself in, he said. Tell me what I'm missing, Caleb said. I have resources in this territory that you don't. Richard said it without heat, just as an accurate account of the facts as he understood them. I have legal standing, I have documentation, I have relationships in the territorial government that predate most of what you see here. He looked around the yard, at the aldermans, at the Purdys, at Harlan, at the open land, at the snow on the hills. This is a very nice gathering, but neighbors with good intentions and an old country doctor are not the equal of what I can bring to bear on a situation like this. Caleb looked at him. A woman you left for dead in October, he said. A claim that cannot be proved, Richard said. James Alderman saw the tracks, Frank said from his spot near the barn. Drag marks in the grass, the shape of where she lay. Ground was frozen, kept the impression. He said it simply. My boy's got a good eye. He saw it before the first snow, and I didn't know what it meant then, but I went back and looked after he told me, and the ground held it longer than you'd think. He looked at Richard with no particular emotion. Man can drag grass marks to a judge, and a judge can look at them. Martin Heaton said something under his breath. Richard did not look at him. Also, Elena said, and her voice was steady, and she was surprised that it was, and she was not going to show the surprise, I wrote a letter. Richard looked at her. 3 weeks ago, she said, when I had enough strength, to August Freer, in Columbus, Ohio. She watched his face and she saw it, the smallest reaction, barely detectable, but there, because August Freer was a name Richard had reason to know. He had gone through her correspondence for 3 years, and he had known about the letter she'd tried to send before and intercepted it, and what had followed was what had followed. He knew who August Freer was. I don't know if it reached him in time, but I wrote what happened, from the beginning, everything, she paused, in detail. The yard was quiet except for the wind. That letter, she said, is a record, regardless of anything else, regardless of your documentation and your lawyers and your relationships in the territorial government. There's a record now in someone's hands who isn't you and isn't controlled by you. She held his eyes. That's a different situation than the one you thought you were walking into. Richard was still for a long moment. Then he said, You were always better at this than you let on. It was the most honest thing she had ever heard him say. She didn't know what to do with it and didn't try. What happened next was not a resolution. That was the thing about real life that stories sometimes got wrong. Things did not resolve cleanly in a single scene. Richard Vane did not confess. He did not crumble. He was not arrested in the yard. He was a man who had spent years managing situations, and he managed this one in the way that a man manages a situation when it hasn't gone the way he planned. He recalibrated. He retreated to legal ground. He stopped saying things that could be quoted back at him. What he said, in the end, was that he would consult with his counsel and return through proper channels. He said it formally, to Martin Heaton more than to anyone else, in the tone of someone closing a meeting. He said it like the yard full of people had not happened, like Elena standing straight in a blue wool dress had not happened. Then he turned his horse and rode out, and his men rode behind him, and the yard watched them go. Frank Alderman exhaled, a long, slow breath through his nose, not quite a sigh. Well, Tom Purdy said. Well, Harlan agreed. Caleb stood and watched the road until they were around the bend and out of sight, and then he turned. Elena was still standing where she'd been. She was looking at the place where the road bent, not at him. Her hands were at her sides, and they were not completely still. A small tremor, barely visible, that she was working to control. He didn't say anything about the hands. He stood beside her. He'll come back, she said quietly. Not as fear, as a fact. I know, Caleb said. Properly, this time. With a writ, probably. Something Heaton has put together. He'll go back to Billings and rebuild the approach. She looked at the road. He doesn't give up. He doesn't quit. How long will it take him to rebuild it? Heaton is thorough, she said, and he knows now that we have Harlan's documentation and Frank Alderman's testimony about the drag marks. He'll want to address those before he comes back. She paused. 2 weeks? Maybe 3. Crane comes through in March, Caleb said. She looked at him. Margaret Purdy said he's not someone Richard can buy, Caleb said. How long can we hold this position before Richard finds a route around it? She thought about it, actually thought about it, the way she did, running the pieces. If we can get the documentation to Crane before Richard's writ is processed through the territorial system, it goes through Billings, it's processed there, and Richard has people in that office. She paused. If we could get it to Crane directly, bypass Billings entirely. Margaret Purdy knows Crane, Caleb said. She looked at him. She said that her husband did survey work for his family, he said. 20 years, but she said it like she's kept the acquaintance. That means she could write to him. He looked at her. A personal letter, not through any office, not through Billings. Elena was quiet for a moment. Would she do that? Let's ask her, Caleb said. He turned toward the Purdys, who were standing near the wagon, with the patient quality of people who understood they were waiting for something. Margaret Purdy caught his eye and came toward them, and she was already wearing the expression of someone who had been waiting for the next part. Mrs. Purdy, Caleb said, we need to ask you something. I already know what it is, Margaret said. She looked at Elena. I'll write the letter today. Elena looked at her. The steadiness she'd been holding in her face through the whole of the morning shifted, just slightly, in the way things shifted at the end of sustained effort when the immediate danger had passed, and the body decided it was finally allowed to feel the weight of what it had been carrying. "Thank you," Elena said. "Don't thank me yet," Margaret said, practically. "Thank me when Crane reads it." The afternoon went quietly, the way afternoons went after something large had moved through and left the air changed. The aldermans went back to their fence line, or the pretense of it, though Frank spent 20 minutes with Caleb going over exactly what he'd seen at the creek in October, and what the ground had preserved and what he was willing to say under what circumstances. And it was a useful 20 minutes. Harlan stayed for another hour and went through the documentation with Elena, adding 2 more observations he wanted on record, and then packed his bag and left with the steady manner of a man who had done what was needed and would do the same thing next time. Tom Purdy's supply delivery turned out to be real. He had brought the corrected order, the one that had been slightly wrong, and he and Caleb unloaded it while Margaret sat inside with Elena. Caleb didn't know exactly what they talked about. He didn't ask. When he came back inside, Elena was at the kitchen table with a cup of tea that had gone cold and a piece of paper in front of her that had writing on it, and Margaret was putting on her coat. "I'll send it tomorrow morning," Margaret said at the door. She looked at Elena. "It will reach him." "I believe you," Elena said, and this time it didn't sound like the words cost her anything, which was not something Caleb had heard from her often. The Purdys left. The yard went quiet. The snow had started again, soft and steady, covering the tracks that 4 horses had made that morning in the mud near the gate. Lily came downstairs from her room where she'd been told to stay. Told firmly, told twice, told with the specific inflection that meant Caleb was serious, and appeared in the kitchen doorway and looked at both of them with an expression that was trying to be patient and was not entirely succeeding. "Is it over?" she said. "For today," Caleb said. Lily came into the kitchen and sat down at the table and looked at Elena carefully, the way she looked when she was assessing something that mattered. "Were you scared?" she said. Elena considered the question honestly. "Yes," she said. "Some." "You didn't look scared," Lily said. "That's the idea," Elena said. Lily nodded slowly, processing this. "So you were scared, but you looked not scared." "That's what scared looks like when you don't let it win," Elena said. Lily thought about this for what appeared to be a meaningful length of time. Then she said, "I'm going to remember that," with the air of someone filing something away for future use. "Good," Elena said. Caleb put the kettle on for fresh tea, because the cup on the table was cold and the afternoon was not. And outside the snow came down and covered the morning's events in white, and somewhere south of them Richard Vane was riding back to Billings to rebuild his approach. And Margaret Purdy was sitting at her own kitchen table composing a letter to a judge who owed nothing to powerful men, and August Freer in Ohio might or might not have a letter in his hand, and the position they were in was better than it had been that morning, but was not safe and was not resolved. He knew it. Elena knew it. But Lily did not know all of it, and she sat at the table and asked Elena to tell her about the owls again. Margaret and Theodore, whether Elena thought they'd stay in the cottonwood through winter or go somewhere else. And Elena said she thought owls with names like that had a certain commitment to their territory. And Lily said she thought so too, and the kettle came up to boil, and the snow kept coming down outside the window, quiet and indifferent and complete. That evening, for the first time since she'd come to the ranch, Elena sat with them in the front room after supper instead of going back to her room. She sat in the chair by the fire with the quilt over her lap, and Lily sat on the floor nearby working on something with a piece of string that she was trying to make into a figure and not quite succeeding. And Caleb sat across with the week's work list on his knee and didn't look at it much. He looked at the fire, mostly. At some point Lily fell asleep on the floor, which was something she did, dropping off suddenly like a candle that had burned to the bottom. And Caleb picked her up and took her to bed and came back to find Elena still in the chair with her eyes open, looking at the fire. "You should sleep," he said. "I know," she said. She didn't move. He sat back down. "Do you think it worked?" she said. "Today." "I think it changed the equation," he said. "I think he expected to find you alone and afraid and hiding. He didn't. That changes what he has to work with. But he still has the letter. He still has Heaton. He still has whatever he's built in that territorial office." "He does," Caleb said. He didn't try to soften it. But now we have Harlan's documentation and Frank's testimony and Margaret's letter to Crane and whatever August Freer does with what you sent him. He looked at the fire. It's not over, but it's different from what it was in October. She was quiet. I keep thinking, she said after a while, about the night I ran the first time. The first time, not the second. I was so certain. I thought I'd planned it well. I thought... She stopped. I was wrong about so many things. You were right to run, he said. I was bad at it, she said. You're alive, he said. That's not bad. She looked at the fire. I don't want to run again, she said. I need you to know that. Whatever happens with Richard and Crane and the letter and all of it, I'm not running. I'm done being the woman who runs. He looked at her. Good, he said. She turned her head and looked at him, and the firelight moved on her face, and she looked tired, genuinely, bone-deep tired, the way she hadn't let herself look in front of the people in the yard that morning, and also like something had settled in her, some argument she'd been having with herself that had finally come down on one side. Thank you, she said, for today. You did most of it, he said. You gave me somewhere to stand, she said. That's not nothing. He didn't have an answer for that, so he said nothing, and the fire burned down, and outside the snow went on falling over the Montana plains in the dark, covering everything evenly, the way it did, without regard for what it covered. The letter from August Freer arrived on a Tuesday in January, 6 weeks after Elena had written it. It came through Tom Purdy's postal route, the one that bypassed Billings, and Tom brought it himself rather than sending it with the usual supply run, which told Caleb something about how seriously Tom was taking the situation. He came in the early afternoon and handed the envelope to Elena directly, which also told Caleb something, that Tom Purdy had decided this was her business to open first, and that decision was its own form of respect. Elena held the envelope for a moment before she opened it. She was standing at the kitchen table, and Caleb was near the stove, and Tom was by the door with his hat in his hands, and none of them said anything while she broke the seal. She read it once, fast, the way she read things. Efficiently, nothing wasted. Then she read it again, slower. Then she set it on the table and put both hands flat on either side of it, like she was steadying something. He's coming, she said. Tom Purdy exhaled. When? Caleb said. 3 weeks. She looked up. He says he received the letter. He says... She stopped, looked down at the page. He says he remembered me from when I was 14 and keeping my father's books, and that a girl who could do that at 14 doesn't lose the capacity in her 30s, and that anyone who says otherwise is selling something. She said it almost carefully, like the words were fragile. He's been practicing law for 40 years, and he knows what a coerced document looks like, and he's prepared to say so before anyone who needs to hear it. She paused. He's bringing a colleague, someone who specializes in marital law in the territory. Caleb crossed to the table and read the letter himself. August Freer wrote in the compressed, precise style of a man who had spent decades making every word count in courtrooms, and the letter was short and direct and left nothing out that needed to be in it. Toward the end, he wrote, I should have come sooner. I knew something was wrong when the correspondence stopped. I told myself it was not my business. I was incorrect about that, and I will not be incorrect about it again. Caleb put the letter down. He blames himself, Elena said quietly. He should have come sooner, Caleb said. So should a lot of people, she said. Not bitter, just true. Tom Purdy cleared his throat. Margaret got a response from Judge Crane last week. She didn't want to say anything until she knew what Freer was going to do. He looked at Elena. Crane's moving his circuit schedule. He'll come through Harlan's Creek in late February instead of March. He said, Tom stopped, seemed to be choosing his words. He said he had reason to look at some documentation that had been moving through the Billings office, and he had questions about the processing. Elena looked at him. He's already seen something. That's what Margaret thinks, Tom said. She thinks someone in the territorial office, not Richard's man, someone else, flagged something and it got to Crane. He paused. Richard may not know Crane is coming early. The kitchen was quiet. Then we have a window, Elena said. She straightened up from the table. Her ribs were nearly healed now. She moved without the careful economy of the early weeks, though sometimes at the end of a long day she pressed one hand to her side in a way she probably didn't know she was doing. If Crane arrives before Richard can get a writ processed and bring it here, the order of things matters. A writ that arrives after a circuit judge has already reviewed the documentation has less weight than one that arrives first. I don't know enough about territorial law to argue that, Caleb said. August Freer does, she said, and apparently so does his colleague. She picked up the letter. We need to get word to Freer about Crane's timeline. If they can coordinate, Margaret will know how to reach Crane directly, Tom said. She's been writing to him already. Elena looked at Caleb. Tell her, Caleb said. Tom nodded, put his hat on, and left with the particular efficiency of a man who understood that time was part of the problem, and he was already using some of it standing in a kitchen. But the 3 weeks that followed were the strangest of all the weeks since October, because they were weeks of waiting, and waiting after action was its own particular difficulty. Elena threw herself into the account books with a focus that Caleb recognized was partly genuine and partly the kind of thing a person did to keep their mind from running ahead to things they couldn't control yet. She reorganized the filing system for the ranch records, not dramatically but usefully, in a way that meant he could find things in seconds instead of minutes, and that a lawyer reviewing them could follow the logic without explanation. She wrote a separate summary document, clear and sequential, of every financial decision made on the ranch in the past 2 years, annotated with the source records. You don't have to do this, Caleb said, one evening when she was still at the desk after supper. I know, she said without looking up. The accounts aren't going to be what matters to Freer or Crane. I know that too. She finished a line, looked up. But I'm better when I have something specific to do. I always was. My father used to say I was the most efficient worrier he'd ever met. I worried, but I worried with a pencil in my hand. Caleb sat down across from her. What was he like? She looked at him, slightly surprised. He did not often ask personal questions, and she had not offered much personal history. Practical, she said. Stubborn. Laughed too loud in church. She caught herself on the word and moved past it smoothly. He had a saying, numbers don't have feelings about the situation, they just are what they are. He thought that was useful to remember. She looked at the books. He was right. It is. When did he die? 8 years ago, before I met Richard. She paused. I've thought about that a lot. Whether things would have been different if he'd still been alive when Richard came along. She tilted her pen between her fingers. Probably. My father was a good reader of men. He would have seen it earlier than I did. You saw it, Caleb said. Eventually. Too late, she said. Not too late, he said. You're here. She looked at him for a moment with that expression she had, the one that was not quite a smile but was the territory around where smiles lived. Then she looked back at the books. Go to bed, Caleb, she said. You've got the east fence tomorrow. You should also go to bed. In a while, she said. He went to bed. When he came through the kitchen at 5:30 the next morning, the lamp on the desk had been turned out, and the books were neatly closed, and the pencil was lined up beside them, and he thought about the word his father had used for a particular kind of person, capable, and thought it was the right word, and also not enough of one. August Freer arrived on a Wednesday, 11 days before Judge Crane's revised schedule brought him through Harlan's Creek. He was 71 years old and traveled with a cane he didn't appear to need, and a younger colleague named Peter Marsh, who carried the briefcase and said little but had watchful eyes and the quality of someone who was filing everything away. Freer himself was a short man, thickly built, with white hair and the kind of face that had stopped bothering to be polite about its opinions a decade ago. He walked into the ranch house, shook Caleb's hand once, firmly, looked around the kitchen with the assessing attention of a man reading a room, and then turned to Elena. He looked at her for a moment. She looked back. You look like your father, he said, around the eyes. She did not say anything for a moment. Then, he would have had things to say about this situation. He would have had very loud things to say about this situation, Freer agreed. Sit down, we have work to do. They worked for 2 days. Freer was not a comfortable man to work with. He asked questions that required precise answers and did not accept approximations. And he went through Elena's account of events with the same thoroughness he apparently applied to everything, which meant they covered some of it 3 times from different angles. He made notes in a handwriting that was compressed and fast and frequently illegible, and Peter Marsh translated them into organized documents with a quiet efficiency that Caleb found impressive. On the second day, Freer spent 3 hours with Doc Harlan going through the medical documentation and came back with a look on his face that was the look of someone who has confirmed what they expected to find and is not pleased by the confirmation. That evening, he sat across from Elena at the kitchen table and said, plainly, "The letter Richard had you write, the one about the condition. A coerced document is a problem to prove, but not an impossible one. The physician who signed it, Fell, has signed similar documents for 2 other cases I've now identified. A pattern is a different legal animal than a single incident." He folded his hands. "I need you to tell me every detail you remember about the circumstances under which that letter was written. Everything. Not the version where you protect yourself from remembering the worst of it, the whole of it." Elena looked at her hands on the table. "All right," she said. Caleb got up and took Lily outside, because some conversations were not for children, and Lily had been hovering near the kitchen with the unconvincing casualness of a child trying to hear something. And he took her to the barn and let her help with the horses and did not rush her, and when he brought her back inside an hour later, Elena was still at the table with Freer, and her face was the face of someone who had been through a difficult thing and come out the other side of it, tired but upright. She caught Caleb's eye and gave him a single nod that meant, "It's done." He nodded back. Judge Aldous Crane came through Harlan's Creek on the 23rd of February, on a gray morning with the smell of coming snow in the air. That was not what Caleb had expected from Margaret Purdy's description. He was younger than he'd imagined, mid-50s, lean, with a weathered face that looked like it had been outdoors for most of those 50-odd years, and quiet eyes that moved constantly and missed very little. He had been a circuit judge for 16 years and before that, a territorial marshal, which perhaps explained the quality of his attention. He met first with Freer and Marsh in the back room of Tom Purdy's store, which Tom had cleared out and made available with characteristic practicality. That meeting lasted 4 hours. Caleb was not in it. Elena was not in it. They sat in Tom's kitchen and drank coffee, and Lily played with a piece of string she'd been working into shapes for 3 weeks now, and time moved the way time did when you were waiting for something you couldn't see and couldn't control. At noon, Crane asked to speak with Elena alone. She went in without hesitating, which Caleb noticed, and which he thought meant something about how far she'd come from the woman who had paused for 10 seconds before giving her own name. He waited outside. She was in there for 90 minutes. When she came out, her face was unreadable in the way it had been in the yard when Richard came, controlled and deliberate, and she walked past him and kept walking to the door of the store and then outside into the cold, and he followed her. She stopped at the edge of the boardwalk and stood in the cold and breathed, in and out, slowly, 3 times, the way you breathed when you were getting yourself back from somewhere far. "It went all right," she said, before he could ask. "He's thorough. He asks the same questions 3 different ways. I think that's how he determines if the answers change." "Do they?" "Not when they're true," she said. She turned and looked at him. He's seen the documents from the billings office, the ones that were flagged. Richard's man there, a deputy clerk named Sorensen, has been processing paperwork incorrectly for 4 years, in a direction that consistently benefits Richard's interests. She paused. "Crane said he's been watching Sorensen for a while." "Richard didn't know," Caleb said. "He may have suspected, but he didn't know Crane knew." She looked at the empty street. "The writ Richard is having processed. It's in Sorensen's queue. Crane is pulling it." Caleb let that settle. "What does that mean?" "It means Richard can't serve it," she said. "He'll have to start over through a clean office. That takes months." She looked at him. "And Crane is referring Dr. Fell's record to the medical board. The coerced letter and the other 2 cases Freer identified." The wind moved through the street and lifted a little snow from the boardwalk edge and scattered it. "It's not finished," Elena said. "Richard will find another approach. He's patient, and he has resources, and he doesn't accept situations he can't eventually rearrange." She said it without flinching. "But the ground has shifted. Every avenue he had open in December is either closed or narrowed. And now there's a record, a real one, not his version, in the hands of people he can't reach." She looked at Caleb. "Freer is filing an application for legal separation on my behalf. Grounds of cruelty, with Harlan's documentation and my own testimony, and 2 corroborating witnesses." She paused. "It will be contested. It will be slow. Territorial divorce law it's not designed for this. But Crane says the documentation is strong enough that Richard's counter-arguments will have trouble finding traction." "How long?" Caleb said. "A year," she said. Maybe 18 months. He stood with that. A lot can happen in 18 months, she said. It can, he agreed. She looked at him directly. She had something to say and she was working out how to say it, which was unusual. Elena was not typically someone who worked out how to say things. She usually just said them. I need to figure out what I'm doing, she said, where I'm going. I can't stay indefinitely. You've given me more than I had any right to expect, and I don't want to. She stopped. I don't want to be a burden that overstays itself. Caleb looked at her for a long moment. Where would you go? He said. I could go to Columbus, she said. Freer has offered me work in his office. I know his accounts, and he knows my mind, and he's 80% serious when he says it. She paused. It would be practical. It would put distance between me and Richard while the legal process runs. Yes, Caleb said. It's the sensible choice, she said. It is, he said. She looked at him. He looked back. The wind moved between them. You're not going to tell me what you think, she said. You didn't ask me what I think, he said. She paused. What do you think? He thought about what he thought. He thought about the account books and the folded blanket and the beef and turnips that were fine but not remarkable, and the way she sat in the front room by the fire that first time without going back to her room. I thought about Lily saying we should take her home the way she said things that were obviously true, and he thought about how rarely people recognize the obviously true things until they were further along than they should have been. I think Lily would miss you, he said. She held his gaze. Lily, she said. And the accounts need another set of eyes, he said. $60 across 8 months, found in 20 minutes. She looked at him for a long moment without saying anything. He could see the calculation running. Not the old calculation, the fearful one, but a different one. Slower, more careful, running the weight of a real choice rather than a survival choice. That's not a reason to stay, she said. No, he agreed. It's not. So what is? He thought about what Agnes had told him once, near the end, when she was tired and honest in the way people became in those last stretches. She'd said, you don't tell people how you feel because you're afraid the feeling won't survive being said out loud. Say it anyway. The ones that matter survive. I don't want you to go, he said. Plain. No embellishment. Elena looked at him. The controlled face, the wall, all of it had been down since she came out of the store and stood in the cold breathing, and what was underneath was just her, tired and steady and clear-eyed, all the things she was that Richard had spent years trying to reduce to a single manageable shape and had not succeeded in reducing. That's a reason, she said. I know it is, he said. She looked at the street for a moment, then back at him. I'm not easy, she said. I don't trust quickly. I have things that need time. I don't know who I am outside of surviving yet. I'm going to get that wrong sometimes. I know, he said. You're not easy either, she said. You don't talk unless you've decided you're talking. You made a decision about me in a frozen field, and you never second-guessed it, which is either very sure or very stubborn, and I haven't decided which. Both, he said. Something happened in her face. Not the almost smile this time. The actual thing, cautious and real, arriving like sun on a February morning. Welcome precisely because it wasn't guaranteed. Both, she said. She stayed. Not because the decision was simple, and not because the road ahead was clear. Richard Vane was still alive and still resourced and still the kind of man who rearranged situations until they suited him, and the legal separation would take the time it took and be contested the way it would be contested, and there were months ahead that would have difficulty in them. But she stayed. In March, when the first suggestion of spring moved through the valley in the form of mud and the smell of the earth coming unfrozen, Elena walked the full perimeter of the ranch for the first time. Not quickly, not without stopping, but completely, all of it, from the east fence line to the north pasture where the creek ran to the far corner of the south field where the land dipped toward the tree line. Caleb walked with her. Lily ran ahead and reported back on things of interest. A hawk's nest in the dead elm, 3 inches of new grass already showing in the low spot near the creek, the state of affairs with Margaret and Theodore in their cottonwood, who had apparently survived the winter and were, in Lily's assessment, looking pleased about it. Elena stood at the North Creek for a long time. He stood beside her and didn't say anything, and she didn't either, for a while. It's different, she said finally. October to March usually is, he said. I mean, she looked at the water, running clear and fast now, nothing like the half-frozen dark creek of that afternoon. I mean, it's different from how I imagined it. In my mind, it was still heavy, dark grass, the ice. She paused. It's just a creek. It is, he said. I think that's better, she said, that it's just a creek. He thought about this, about what it meant for a place that had nearly been the end of something to become just itself. An ordinary piece of running water in an ordinary march, with mud on the banks, and a hawk overhead, and a child somewhere behind them calling out that she'd found frog eggs. Were they supposed to be here yet? Was this early for frog eggs? Someone should check. Yes, he said. I think it is. In April, a letter came from Martin Heaton's office informing them formally that Richard Vane was contesting the separation filing and listing the grounds. Freer had anticipated all of them and had already prepared responses, which arrived 2 days later in a separate envelope, as if Freer had known the timeline before Heaton did. Elena read both letters at the kitchen table and then put them in the file she'd made for the legal correspondence and closed the file and made coffee. He's contesting, Caleb said. Of course he is, she said. Freer's ready. Are you? She poured the coffee and brought it to the table and sat down. I'm not afraid of it, she said. That's different from ready, but it's enough. He believed her. He'd learned to believe her on the things she stated plainly, because she didn't state things plainly unless she'd already tested them against the hardest version of the truth. In May, Lily asked Elena to teach her how to do accounts. This happened at breakfast on a Tuesday, as casually as Lily asked for most things, directly, without preamble, as though the answer was obviously going to be yes and she was just conveying the schedule. You're 7, Elena said. I know how old I am, Lily said, which was what she always said. 7 is young to start accounts. You started at 14 and you said you wished it had been sooner. Elena looked at her. I said that? Last week, when Daddy was looking at the wrong column. Elena looked at Caleb. He raised his hands. I was looking at the right column, he said. I was just looking at it wrong. Those are the same thing, Elena and Lily said, at the same time, with the same inflection, and then looked at each other, and Lily burst out laughing, and Elena put her hand over her mouth in the way she did when she was trying to keep the laugh contained and it wasn't entirely working. Caleb looked at both of them and felt something so large and ordinary that it didn't have a name. Or it did have a name, but the name had been said so many times by so many people in so many lesser situations that it felt too worn to carry what he actually meant. He was happy. That was the word. Simple and insufficient and completely true. The separation was granted in November, 13 months after Elena had first been carried through the door of the ranch house with broken ribs and a fever coming on. The letter from Freer arrived on a Wednesday, and Elena read it standing at the kitchen table the same way she'd read his first letter and put it down with both hands flat on the table beside it. Caleb was in the doorway. She looked at him. It's done, she said. He crossed to the table. He looked at the letter, at Freer's compressed, precise handwriting, at the language that was legal and dry and meant that Richard Vane no longer had standing to call Elena his wife, or to use her name, or to send Roy Casper to sit in tree lines watching ranch houses. What does he get? Caleb said. He meant Richard. Nothing I want to keep, she said. The house in Billings, the valley property, the cattle. She paused. He gets to keep being Richard Vane, which is a worse punishment than anything the law is going to give him. Caleb looked at her. Freer's colleague filed the fell documentation with the medical board, she said. The board pulled his license last month. Richard lost his best argument and he's lost the doctor who made it. She looked at the letter. It's not justice. I know that. He hurt people for years and he'll go on living well and being carefully terrible in ways that are harder to prove. She said it without bitterness, just as the fact about the world that she had made her peace with. But I'm outside it. That's what I have. He thought about what he wanted to say and then said the plainest version of it, because that was what he had, and it was enough. You're not just outside it, he said. You're here. She looked at him. There are things that happen between people that don't require narration, that exist in the space between words, in what the body knows before the mind finishes deciding. What happened between them in that kitchen on that November afternoon was one of those things, and it was ordinary and real and imperfect and enough. The following spring, when the mud had dried and the east fence had been rebuilt properly, and the account book showed the first full year of solid footing since Agnes had died, Lily stood in the yard in the early morning light and watched the cottonwood, where Margaret and Theodore had their nest, and Elena came and stood beside her. "They stayed," Lily said. "I told you they would," Elena said. "Owls with names like that have a commitment to their territory." Lily leaned against her, the casual, unself-conscious leaning of a child who has decided someone is safe, and Elena put her arm around Lily's shoulders the way she had learned to do. Not stiffly, not with the hesitation of the early months, but as something that simply fit. They stood there a while. Caleb watched them from the barn door without announcing himself, because some moments were not improved by addition. He was a man who had learned, later than he should have, that happiness was not a thing that arrived complete and finished. It arrived the way spring arrived in Montana, inconsistent, interrupted by cold snaps, occasionally setting back to something that felt like winter, just when you'd put the good coat away. It required maintenance and patience, and the willingness to look at an ordinary Tuesday morning and understand that ordinary Tuesday mornings were, in fact, the thing. He had not gone looking for any of this. He had ridden north because a horse had opinions about the south pasture, and a little girl had said we should take her home, and a woman in a frozen field had moved her fingers just enough to answer. That was what life did sometimes. It put things in your path that you couldn't have found if you'd gone looking, because looking would have taken you in the wrong direction. It required you to be paying attention to the right creek at the right moment, which was mostly luck, and then to do something with what you found, which was not luck at all. He thought about what Elena had said in the early days, that the knowing and the feeling were not the same thing, and that she was working on the feeling. He thought about how long it had taken him after Agnes to trust that warmth was not temporary, that it was not something that would be taken back. He thought about Lily, who had known before either of them, because children who have known loss develop a specific kind of vision for things that are worth keeping. People talked about second chances like they were gifts, like they arrived with a ribbon on them. They didn't. They arrived broken and complicated and requiring work, and the work was not clean, and the outcomes were not guaranteed, and most of it happened in kitchens over account books and cold coffee and arguments about columns. But the work was the point. The work was where the life actually was. Elena looked over her shoulder and saw him in the barn door, and she didn't wave because she was Elena and waving was a bit much. She just looked at him for a moment in the early spring light, and then she looked back at the cottonwood where Margaret and Theodore were doing whatever owls did in the early morning. And Lily said something Caleb couldn't hear, and Elena laughed, really laughed, without covering it. And the sound of it crossed the yard and reached him where he stood. And it was one of those ordinary Tuesday sounds that a person could live on for a very long time. The ranch woke up around them. The cattle moved in the low pasture. The horses shifted in the barn. The east fence held. And the woman who had been left to die beside a frozen creek in October stood in the spring light with her arm around a little girl who had first seen her fingers move and was, simply and completely and without apology, alive.